Fame and Fortune Weekly, Stories of Boys Who Make Money, Number 4, October 27th, 1905. Published by Frank Tousey. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. A Game of Chance, or The Boy Who Won Out, by a Self-Made Man. Chapter 1, which introduces 3 important characters. "Please let me pass, Mr. Jarvis," said a pretty but plainly clad girl in a tone of remonstrance as she stepped back and endeavored to walk around a well-dressed but not over-prepossessing boy of 17 years who had deliberately placed himself in her path. "I've got something to say to you, Jessie Fairweather," answered the boy, changing his position so as to block her progress. "But I want to go home," persisted the girl firmly. "Pooh, you've lots of time. It's only 5:30. "It's getting dark, and you have no right to detain me," protested the girl with no little indignation. "You ought to be glad to be seen talking to me," said the youth loftily. "You ought to be ashamed of yourself to annoy me in this way." "Who's annoying you? You're only a factory girl." "I'm not ashamed of that fact. I suppose you consider yourself a gentleman," the girl said scornfully. "Of course I'm a gentleman," said the boy, elevating his chin proudly. "I don't have to work, and my father is the most important man in this town." There was not the least doubt but that Louis Jarvis had an excellent opinion of himself. His father, Squire Jarvis, was the foremost lawyer in town, a director of the National Bank, and a stockholder in the Northport cotton mills. He lived in one of the most pretentious houses in the exclusive residential district, and naturally was looked upon and deferred to as a man of wealth and influence. Louis was impressed, as many boys are under such circumstances, with a sense of his own consequence. Particularly as being an only son, he was allowed his own way a good bit, and this made itself felt in his intercourse with his companions, as well as all others of less social importance with whom he came in contact. Jessie Fairweather was an uncommonly pretty girl of 16 years. She had laughing blue eyes and a creamy complexion, set off with a wealth of golden hair that streamed about her shapely shoulders. She was bright and piquant, and a general favorite among her companions. Indeed, everyone who had the slightest acquaintance with Miss Jenny liked her, for her disposition was lovable and her manners those of a little lady. She lived with her mother and a young sister in a small unpretentious cottage on the outskirts of Northport, for the Fairweathers were in very moderate circumstances, which accounted for the fact that Jessie was employed in the cotton mills. It is true Mrs. Fairweather owned the little house in which they lived, but this represented the sum total of their earthly possessions. Captain Edward Fairweather, the husband and father, was supposed to have been lost at sea, for since the day 3 years before he sailed for Boston Harbor in his good ship Morning Star, not a word had been heard of the vessel or crew. Although Louis Jarvis associated with the better class of Northport's young people, he had what we may call a sneaking regard for Jessie Fairweather. Her good looks and attractive ways had impressed him, and he figured that because she was poor, she must naturally regard it as an honor for him to single her out from the other working girls. But Jessie did not look at the matter in that light. She had seen too much to dislike in Louis Jarvis to regard him with favor, even if his father was reputed to be the richest man in Northport. Therefore she resented his impertinence in thrusting his company upon her that afternoon when she came out on the street through the employees' entrance to the factory yard. "Then if you are a gentleman, you will allow me to pass," she said in response to Master Jarvis's lofty assertion. "All right," agreed Louis, "if you promise to let me see you home." "I prefer to go home alone," making another effort to get by him. "Not when you can get that pauper Will Sommers to go along with you," cried the boy angrily, suddenly seizing her by the wrist. At that moment a gate near at hand swung open, and a boy about his own age, with a bright, manly face, which, however, was somewhat disfigured by the grime of the engine-room, clad in a pair of overalls and a check jumper, came out wheeling an iron barrel filled with ashes and clinkers. "Let go of my hand, Mr. Jarvis," cried Jessie, stamping her little foot resentfully. Will you let me go home with you?" "No!" she cried with a defiant toss of her head. "Then you can't go until I choose to let you," he retorted angrily. "How dare you treat me in this manner?" she cried with flashing eyes. "Because I choose to do so." The boy in the overalls and jumper had seen Louis Jarvis grab Jessie Fairweather by the wrist and easily overheard all that followed. His natural chivalry toward the fair sex told him it was time to interfere, even without reference to the fact that he looked upon the girl as a particular friend. So he dropped the wheelbarrow, stepped up to the son of Northport's magnate, and laying his hand on his shoulder, said with quiet determination, "I think you had better let Miss Fairweather go home if she wants to." Louis started back in some little trepidation, for he knew that he was in the wrong, and Jessie took advantage of the moment to snatch her hand from his grasp. But when he recognized who it was that had interfered, his brow grew as black as thundergust, and he snorted, "What do you mean, you pauper, you? How dare you lay your dirty hand on me?" "I interfered because you are annoying Miss Fairweather," said the newcomer in straightforward tones. He raised his soft felt hat politely to the girl. "You common fireman! I've a good mind to—" He doubled up his fists in a threatening manner, but the calm, undaunted look which the other gave him convinced Louis that discretion was the better part of valor. "How dare you butt in where you're not wanted?" "If you can convince me that I was in the wrong, I am willing to apologize," said the working lad with a genial smile. "You are not in the wrong, Will Sommers," spoke up Jessie Fairweather quickly. "Mr. Jarvis was acting in a very rude way to me, and I am very much obliged to you for coming to my aid." "You hear that, Louis Jarvis?" said Will grimly. "What have you to say for yourself?" "None of your business what I have to say, but I'll tell you one thing, smart Aleck. I'll get square with you for this." "All right," responded Sommers cheerfully. "I think, however, you owe Miss Fairweather an apology for your conduct toward her. If you don't get down on your knees right now and beg my pardon for sticking your nose into my affairs, I'll see that you are discharged tomorrow from your job in the factory engine room," threatened Jarvis hotly. "Much obliged for your kind intention, Louis Jarvis," returned Will Sommers disdainfully. "But when I get down on my knees to you, just let me know, will you?" "Pah, you common laborer!" cried the squire's son in a rage. "My father is one of the owners of this mill. He's only got to say the word to have you fired. I'll see that he does it," he added vindictively. "Your father isn't the only stockholder, nor the biggest one, Louis Jarvis," retorted Will calmly. "I may be a common mechanic, as you say, but I understand my business here and attend to it. So I don't think the superintendent will discharge me without sufficient reason. Simply to oblige you isn't any reason at all." "You'll see," replied Jarvis darkly, moving off without paying any further attention to Jessie Fairweather, who had not taken advantage of this controversy to continue on her way, but stood by, hoping her presence would prevent a serious mix-up between the two boys. Maybe there was another reason, too, for it was a fact that Jessie greatly admired young Will Sommers. She knew he was a good boy, an earnest, hard worker, the sole support of a widowed mother and a younger brother and sister. She knew that everybody that knew Will liked him, because he was polite and gentlemanly to all, and considerate of the feelings of even the smallest girl or boy in the factory. She knew that a considerable part of his spare time was spent in study in order to better his condition. He had an eye to the future. Will Sommers was generally recognized about the mills as a smart boy. He had lately invented an improvement in the damper regulator of the engine, which had proved an economizer of coal, and a patent for it had been applied for in his name by the superintendent, who, in recognition of his benefit in the engine room, had given him a welcome increase in salary. He was now at work on another scheme, designed to recover and utilize a larger percentage of the wasted steam. This was a project that engaged the attention of many of the brightest minds in the engineering line at that very moment, for it was known that by far the greater proportion of the units of the mist formed by condensed vapor, otherwise known as steam, went to waste. Consequently, any invention which would serve to utilize a larger number of those infinitesimal particles would prove of untold value in economizing the coal consumption. As Louis Jarvis turned on his heel and strode away, his small mind brooding upon the retaliation he hoped to be able to inflict on the boy who had dared to cross him, Jessie walked up to Will and, holding out her hand, said, "I hope you will understand that I am very grateful to you for what you did for me, and I trust you will not get into any trouble over it." "Don't worry about that, Jessie. I'm not afraid of anything Louis Jarvis can do with such a lame excuse to work upon. I'm very glad I was able to be of service to you, for there is no girl I would sooner—" And then he stopped in embarrassment. "Thank you," she answered with just the suspicion of a blush. "Isn't it most time for you to go home?" "Yes. If you wouldn't mind waiting a few minutes, I'd be happy to escort you home," he said eagerly. "I'll wait, for it's getting quite dark now, and I should be glad to have you with me." 5 minutes later, they left the yard of the engine house together. End of Chapter 1. Chapter 2 of A Game of Chance by a Self-Made Man. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 2, in which Louis Jarvis, having failed to get square with Will Sommers, decides to even up things with Jessie Fairweather. Superintendent Harper of the Northport Cotton Mills was in his office the morning after the affair mentioned in the previous chapter when Squire Jarvis walked in unannounced. "Good morning, Mr. Harper," said the magnate blandly. "Well, Squire Jarvis, in what way can I be of service to you?" asked the superintendent, wheeling about in his chair. "I'm sorry that I have to make a serious complaint against one of your employees," began the nabob somewhat brusquely. "Indeed, I regret to hear that such is the reason of your visit. Who is the person to whom you refer, and what is the nature of the offense?" "I will explain, sir. My son Louis happened to be in this neighborhood last evening at 5:30, which is the hour the mill shuts down for the day, I believe." The superintendent nodded. "He stopped to speak to one of the girls. Her name is Fairweather, I believe, when a boy by the name of Sommers, employed in the engine room, came up and, laying one of his greasy hands on my son's clean clothes, broke up the interview by saying it was time for the girl to go home. Louis very properly resented this unwarranted interference, whereupon the Sommers boy insulted him in a gross manner." "I'm sorry to hear you bring such a charge against young Sommers, Squire Jarvis. Are you sure there isn't some mistake? Will Sommers is the brightest boy in this establishment, and is noted for his gentlemanly conduct." "No mistake whatever," answered the squire positively. "My son stated the case very fairly to me. I judged from his manner that he rather underestimated the gravity of the offense, being unwilling, no doubt, to have this aggressor too severely punished, which is to his credit. As a large stockholder in this company, I wish you to understand that I cannot permit my son to be insulted by one of the employees. I therefore request that you will immediately discharge this Sommers boy." "I will take the matter under consideration, Squire Jarvis," politely responded the superintendent. "The charge will be investigated. It is only fair that young Sommers be given a hearing in his own defense. I will also hear what Miss Fairweather has to say about it. Tell your son to call here at 2 o'clock this afternoon, and I will listen to his side of the question. If I find that Will Sommers has not treated your son fairly, I will see that he is disciplined." "I should think, Mr. Harper, that my statement of the case ought to be sufficient," said the nabob pompously. "My son would not lie to me. He has too much respect for himself and the position he occupies in society to make a charge not founded on fact. I may say that this is not the first time this Sommers boy has failed in according my son the respect to which he is entitled. It is a rule of mine never to proceed against any employee without having thoroughly sifted the evidence in the case. As a lawyer, you understand that everyone, no matter how humble his or her position, is entitled to an equal show of justice." "Very well," responded the nabob stiffly. "I shall expect that you will look into this thing at once. As soon as the Sommers boy's offense has been shown to your satisfaction, I look to you to discharge him immediately." Superintendent Harper made no reply to this, and the squire, taking his silence in an affirmative sense, rose from the chair, bowed coldly, and left the office. "This isn't at all like Will Sommers," muttered Mr. Harper after he had sent to the engine-room for the boy. "Young Jarvis has evidently exaggerated the affair to suit his own views." Will presently reported at the superintendent's office, clad in his overalls and jumper, and his bright, manly young face favorably impressed the official whose duty it was to pass on the merits of the alleged difficulty. "You wish to see me, Mr. Harper?" asked the lad modestly. "Yes, Will. I regret to say that a charge has been made against you by Squire Jarvis. He has just left." "I expected it," replied the boy cheerfully. "Louis Jarvis and I had a run-in last night about closing time, and he threatened to tell his father and have me discharged." The superintendent smiled good-naturedly. "I will hear what you have to say about it," he said kindly. Will at once rehearsed the cause of the trouble and referred to Jessie Fairweather for corroboration of his story. Mr. Harper nodded, as if he put a good deal of faith in the boy's statement. "I will send for the lady in the case," he said genially. "You may return to the engine-room. Rest assured you will be treated with perfect fairness." Jessie Fairweather was called down from the operating-room, and she backed up Will's story with an earnestness that called up a smile to the superintendent's face. "I see you have a friendly feeling for Will Sommers," he said. "I have," she replied without any embarrassment. "He has been very kind to Mother and myself, and I'm sure I like him very much." "That is all, Miss Fairweather." "You don't think he'll be discharged for taking my part, do you, sir?" she asked anxiously. "I don't think you need worry about that," he replied with a quizzical smile. "Thank you." Much against his will, Louis Jarvis called on the superintendent that afternoon and gave his version of the difficulty. His statement showed so much personal rancor against Will that the brief cross-examination to which he was subjected convinced Mr. Harper that there was no ground on which to proceed against Will in the matter, and accordingly he dismissed the charge, writing a note to Squire Jarvis to that effect. Louis was very much dissatisfied with the outcome of the affair. Having failed to get square with Will Sommers, he now transferred a portion of his enmity to Jessie Fairweather. "She's a stuck-up thing for a poor mill hand," he said to himself with an air of disgust as he was retiring for the night. "I'd like to take her down a peg or two. I believe she's stuck on that mechanic, and he acts as if he was gone on her. If I could only manage to get her fired from the factory, to make them both feel sore, and so I could kill two birds with one stone. I know what I'll do. Tessie Rickson is jealous of her. She likes Sommers herself. Perhaps I can put something into Tessie's head that'll give her a chance to get that Fairweather girl into trouble. She'll grab at such a scheme in a minute. If it works, it'll be all right. If it doesn't, and Tessie gets into trouble over it, why, that'll be her lookout. In any case, I don't risk anything. I'll see her tomorrow. It'll be a cold day when things don't come my way." With which charitable reflection he hopped into bed and was soon asleep. End of Chapter 2. Chapter 3 of A Game of Chance by a Self-Made Man. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 3, in which Louis Jarvis interviews Tessie Rickson and afterwards hears something that gives him great satisfaction. The factory hands had an hour for lunch, and most of the girls went home for the midday meal. Tessie Rickson was one of these, and Louis Jarvis, in accordance with his amiable intentions toward Jessie Fairweather, took care to meet her as if by accident on the way to her father's cottage. Miss Rickson was a tall, somewhat angular young person with red hair, which, however, she referred to as auburn, a freckled face, a vinegary-looking mouth, and a turned-up nose. While she wasn't prepared to admit even to herself what other people would see with half an eye, that she was decidedly plain so far as looks were concerned, she was jealous of every girl who received more attention from the boys than herself. She was particularly down on Jessie Fairweather because everybody said Jessie was the prettiest girl in Northport, and chiefly because she, Tessie, was somewhat sweet on Will Sommers, and all the other girls said Jessie was Will's sweetheart. Had she been mentally capable of originating any plan to get square with the captain's daughter, she would have put it into practice long ago. Fortunately, her powers in that direction were rather limited. But she was mean and reckless enough to put into execution any scheme that might be suggested to her, that had for its object the humiliation of Jessie Fairweather. Consequently, as Louis Jarvis had surmised, she was an easy tool for him to use. "Good afternoon, Tessie," said Louis, taking off his hat to her. "Good afternoon, Mr. Jarvis," she replied, pleased to be addressed by the nabob's son. "I suppose you don't object to my company for a little way, do you?" he said with a smirk intended to be fetching. "Not at all. On the contrary, I shall consider it an honor," she answered, hoping some of her girl friends would see her walking with the magnate's son, and that the sight would make them turn green with jealousy. "It is too bad that such a pretty girl as you should have to work on such a pleasant day," proceeded the astute Master Jarvis, with a polite grin. "Isn't it?" cried Tessie in a discontented tone. "However, I don't expect to work always, Mr. Jarvis." "Sure you won't. Some rich young fellow, like myself, for instance, will come along and snap you up when you aren't thinking." "I'm afraid the other girls would be all jealous of me then," said Tessie, delighted at the suggestion, which had not occurred to her before. "I guess they would, especially Jessie Fairweather." "I hear she doesn't like you for a cent," said Louis artfully, "and doesn't care who knows it." "I hate her," snapped Miss Rickson vindictively. "She isn't so much, though she seems to think half the boys are crazy over her," continued the boy. "Do you think she's pretty?" "No, I don't. Do you?" asked Tessie with compressed lips. "Not by a jugful. I like the color of your hair much better than hers." "Do you really? You're making fun of me, aren't you?" she added doubtfully. "I'm not. Her hair is nice enough in its way, but yours is the most fashionable shade. I heard my mother say so." A whopper or two by the boy did not worry his conscience a great deal when they assisted him in the attainment of some object he had in view. Miss Rickson was very pleased to hear that Mrs. Jarvis, the leader of Northport society, had actually noticed and favorably commented on her hair. She would take care that all the girls she knew should hear about it. "If I were you, I wouldn't stand for Jessie Fairweather going about and telling the other girls that you had carroty hair and—" "Did she say that?" almost gasped Tessie with flashing eyes. "Not only carroty hair," added Louis, smothering a grin with his hand, "but freckles as large as warts." "The idea!" screamed Miss Rickson, now mad as a hornet. "I mean, the artful creature!" "That isn't all," went on Louis in his soft way. "I suppose you wouldn't believe she said your mouth was big enough to eat snowballs." "I'll get square with her for that," snapped a thoroughly enraged girl, clenching her coarse brown hands. "That's right. I wouldn't let anyone crow over or make fun of me," said Louis, egging the poor, deluded girl on. "I heard she was making fun of you before Will Sommers the other night. Said you were only a bundle of bones. She was afraid to touch you for fear you'd rattle, and somebody might think one of the machines was out of order." "Oh, I'll fix her, the flaxen-haired thing!" exclaimed Tessie furiously. "Look here," said Louis, tapping her on the shoulder. "Do you know what a girl did once to another girl who talked about her in that way?" "No, I don't. What did she do?" asked Miss Rickson with some interest. "She got her fired from the shop where they both worked." "Served her right. I'd give a good deal to get that washed-out blonde discharged from our place." "This girl managed, somehow or other, to have a purse that did not belong to her found in one of the other girl's pockets. She was accused of theft, and as she couldn't prove she didn't take it, she was thrown out by the boss. It ought to be easy to work a thing like that. Now, mind, I don't tell you to do it. You've got too kind a heart to do anything like that, I know." "Oh, yes," gritted the furious maiden, grasping at the idea like a drowning man at a straw. "I'm too kind-hearted. I wouldn't think of doing such a thing." "But how do you know this patsy-faced Miss Fairweather would not steal the purse if she got the chance?" "That's a fact," admitted Louis, humoring her. "And if 'twas found on her, 'twould show she was really a thief, wouldn't it?" "Sure it would." snickered Louis, now feeling sure of the girl. "I shouldn't be surprised if something like that actually did happen. We girls are very careless with our purses. If I should miss mine, I'll know who to accuse." By that time they had reached the gate of the poor-looking Rickson cottage, and Louis was on the point of bidding the girl good-bye when Joe Rickson, her father, appeared at the door, and asked him if he would not walk in, as he wanted to see him about a matter of importance. Young Jarvis was not anxious for an interview with Tessie's father, but as he saw no way out of it, he followed the girl into the house. While she repaired to the dining room to get her dinner, the old man led Louis into the darkened sitting room and asked him to sit down near his old mahogany escritoire. Joe Rickson looked older than he really was. He was thin and spare like his daughter, with closely cropped carroty hair and freckled features. He was mean and miserly by disposition, and though he had a fat account in the town savings bank, he always declared that he was not worth a cent. He kept his house and property in poor shape so as to hoodwink the assessor, but after all, he deceived nobody so much as himself. He often loaned money to his neighbors, on the best of security, of course. While the state law prevented him from exacting usurious interest, he had ways and means of getting around the law that were unique. "Do you think your father would be willing to collect a note for me?" began Mr. Rickson. "Sure, why not? That's part of his business, isn't it?" said Louis in some surprise. "I thought I'd ask you because this here note's been running a long time, and I hain't made no great attempt to collect it, 'cause the party hain't any too well fixed, you see, and it kind of goes again my grain to push poor people to the wall." "The note isn't outlawed, is it?" asked Master Jarvis suspiciously. "No, not for 4 months yet." "It's good, then. How much is it for?" $300. I really can't afford to lose so much money." "Who is it against?" "It is signed by Nat Sommers. He's dead, you know, but I reckon his widder is responsible for it." "Who did you say?" said Louis in some excitement. "Nat Sommers? Will Sommers' father?" "You've got it just right, young man," replied Mr. Rickson, nodding his head. "You give me that note, Mr. Rickson," cried Louis, jumping to his feet, "and my father'll collect it for you all right." The old man promptly produced the note in question, and after the boy had looked it over to see that it was all right, he started for his father's office. "By the great horn spoon!" he ejaculated. "This is luck. I don't believe Mrs. Sommers will be able to pay it. This is where I have got the squeeze on that low-down mechanic, Will Sommers. You'll put your greasy paws on me, will you? Oh, father and I won't do a thing to you this time, you pauper. I've got you where I want you now, and I'll make you eat humble pie all right." With this pious feeling in his mind, he hurried along the street. End of Chapter 3. Chapter 4 of A Game of Chance by a Self-Made Man. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 4 The Game of Chance. As the Fairweather and Sommers homesteads, some 5 acres each, adjoined one another on the suburbs of Northport, it was quite the usual thing of late for Will and Jessie to get home together after their day's work. At closing time on the day that Master Jarvis had his interview with Tessie Rickson, Jessie found Will waiting for her at the gate. "I'm on time tonight, all right," he said in a tone of satisfaction as he bowed politely to several of the other girls passing out at the moment. "Are you glad?" "I'm afraid it will make you dreadfully conceited if I admit I am," said Jessie with a tantalizing little laugh. "You boys do think such an awful lot of yourselves." "Come now, Jessie, you're too hard on us," remonstrated Will with a grin as they started off together. "Am I? Really? Why, I never look at Louis Jarvis, but I almost fancy the world isn't quite large enough to hold him comfortably," laughed the girl. "Louis Jarvis is in a class all by himself so far as this town is concerned. I shouldn't feel at all flattered if you compared me with him. I certainly wouldn't think of doing such a thing. He isn't a real boy. And just think, he calls himself a gentleman because he doesn't have to work and because his father is looked upon as one of the biggest men in town. A gentleman wouldn't act the way he did the night before last," said Jessie scornfully. "I should say not," answered Will emphatically. "You didn't lose any time trying to get me bounced because I interfered on your behalf, but his pull didn't seem to work. He's mean enough to do almost anything. Of course, he's got it in for me now, but I ain't afraid of anything he can do. There isn't anything against me at the mill, and I don't propose there shall be, as I make it a point to attend strictly to my business during working hours." "Mother says you're bound to become a successful man if you live," said the girl with a look of admiration at her escort. "That's what I'm aiming for," replied the boy with modest confidence. "You intend to become an engineer, I suppose?" "Certainly, but I don't mean to stop at that. One of these days I hope to own at least a part of a mill myself, and a thorough knowledge of the requirements of the engine room ought to be of great value to the proprietor himself." "You're aiming high, Will," said Jessie with a smile. "I think every young fellow ought to aim high in this world if he ever expects to land in a good place where he can make money. That's something many boys, Louis Jarvis, for instance, don't feel called upon to worry about. The money is already provided for them in advance." "All the same, I wouldn't change places with Louis Jarvis. Money isn't everything, not by a long shot. It sometimes has wings and disappears all of a sudden. If he puts all his reliance on his father's wealth, and it should happen to get away from him one of these days after he has grown up, where will he be at?" "I'm not good at guessing conundrums, Will," laughed the girl. "And that reminds me of a conundrum with which you are connected, and which I have been trying hard to solve ever since last winter." "What's that, Jessie?" asked the boy curiously. "The girls all call it Will Sommers' folly whenever they speak about it." "Oh, I know what you refer to now," grinned the boy. "And perhaps they may be right, though until the fact be proved, I must beg to differ with them. I call it a game of chance. It's a toss-up whether I come out ahead or not. But I think the odds, if anything, should be in my favor, for I have worked the thing on a sort of scientific basis. While I feel confident I have gone the right way about it to reach results, it doesn't follow that I shall succeed. When dealing with such a treacherous proposition as the quaking bog, as the people call it, or the 10-acre swamp lot, as I call it, a fellow can't feel very sure where he's going to come out. Success means a good thing, Jessie. Failure means, well, the loss of $25 cash, and a great many hours of the hardest work I ever put into my life. But, worst of all, it'll mean the grand laugh at my expense." "Do let me into the secret, won't you?" said Jessie persuasively. "For there is a secret, I know. You're too smart a boy to go into any scheme blindfolded. It isn't like you. It may be a game of chance, as you call it, but I'm certain there's some method in your madness." "Well, Jessie, at least I had the advantage of one man's failure to give me a wrinkle before I went into the thing." "It was such a total failure that I wonder you ever took up with it." "That's what it was. When Mr. Rickson bought that swamp lot at what he thought was a bargain, he was under the impression that all he had to do was erect a strong dam across the outlet of the bog at the beginning of cold weather, and by confining the water which constantly soaked into the swamp from the springs and small streams from the ledgy hills above, overflow the lot. At first, nobody, including myself, could understand what he was trying to get at." "I remember," laughed Jessie. "But when the boom in ice began and the papers were full of accounts of almost fabulous prices paid for ice privileges which lay convenient for shipping, whether they were mill ponds or freshwater marshes, the object of Mr. Rickson's dam was apparent." "Just so," agreed Will. "He intended to overflow the swamp to make a 10-acre pond. From the pond thus formed to the wharf below is about 200 yards, and a descending grade all the way, so that by means of a cheap chute, the ice, after having been marked out and cut into proper-sized chunks, could be sent sliding down to the very verge of the wharf, there to be taken on board of vessels ready to receive it. It was a great scheme, wasn't it?" "Yes, but unfortunately for Mr. Rickson, it turned out a great failure." "That's right. Still, how could he guess that the very effort he made to flood the surface of the lot would merely cause the swamp itself to rise until it was nearly level with the land around it?" "What made it act that way?" "One would naturally think that the incoming water, finding its escape cut off, would form a pond there. That's the way Mr. Rickson figured, but here's how he came to get left. The roots of the moss and matted grass on which the swamp was composed could find no holding ground on the soft black mud underneath, so that inflowing water, finding itself deprived of its usual outlet by the dam, raised the whole mass with it. There was no lack of water, don't you see? But it was under the surface of the swamp instead of overflowing it." "What a shame," giggled Jessie as the ludicrous side of the affair came to her. "Yes, it was tough on Mr. Rickson, who had expected to sell the ice privilege for several $1,000s. "I should think that ought to have been less than enough for you," said Jessie with an inquiring look. "It was, only not in the sense you look at it. I admit I gave Mr. Rickson the laugh with the rest, and several times I visited the place to look at the sell. It was on one of those occasions that an idea came to me, so I set my wits to work to put it into tangible shape. I studied the character of the swamp, and the result was satisfactory. Then I sought a means to carry out my plan. I found them at hand. All that remained was the manual labor, for which I could not afford to pay. So I tackled it myself when I could find the time. And you can gamble on it, Jessie, there wasn't an ounce of fun in it." "I shouldn't think there was," admitted the girl. "Judging from what you told me at the time, though you would not gratify my curiosity by telling me the reason for a proceeding which seemed so senseless to everyone who heard about it." "Well, I'm telling you now, but you must keep it quiet." "I won't say a word, honor bright," protested Jessie. "I bought the swamp lot and the dam just as it stood for Mr. Rickson for $25. I agreed to remove a big heap of stones as tall as a barn from Farmer Bott's land hard by, on condition that he would let me have the use of his ox team for that purpose." "He must have thought you were crazy." "Probably he did, but he wasn't fool enough to say no, as he had the soft end of the bargain. When the swamp lot had frozen over so that it would bear the ox team, I began to use up all my spare time of night hauling rocks from Boggs Field to the basin in which lay the swamp lot, and I spread them in heaps over the surface of the ice. I'd haste to tell you how many tons I deposited there before the end of winter. I was mighty glad when I got away with the last load." "I know all about that, Will Sommers. Everybody knows it. Lots of people have gone over there and looked at those piles of rocks and wondered what you were trying to get at, but they couldn't guess any more than I." "As it wasn't any business of theirs, I didn't take the trouble to enlighten them. I haven't any use for butters in, Jessie." "Do you include me in that remark, Will? If you remember, I was just as curious as anybody else," said the girl with a quizzical smile. "Present company always accepted," said the boy hastily, whereat she laughed gaily. "Well," she said, "I'm waiting patiently for this explanation you promised to give me. I'm still as much in the dark as ever." "After I had finished with the rocks, I took down part of the dam and waited. When the ice began to melt with the coming of spring, the stones gradually disappeared among the moss and grass. Then the swamp looked the same as it ever did. Since then, I've simply been waiting." "For what, pray?" "For winter to set in again. This is October. In a week or so I'll repair the dam and let the water collect. I expect it will be on the surface, not under the swamp this time." "Why should it be any different with you than what it was with Mr. Rickson?" "Because I trust that the rocks, which have gone down pretty evenly into the matted grass and moss, will anchor down the entire surface of the bog. Should this prove to be the case, the formation of a 10-acre pond will be a simple proposition." "Oh!" exclaimed Jessie, a great light dawning in upon her mind. "If it does, I shall have as pretty a pond as you ever saw in your life, a field of clear ice worth at least $3,000 or $4,000. "What a head you've got, Will Sommers!" cried the girl in admiration of his genius. "If I fail, my name will resemble the soil under the swamp." "What is that?" asked Jessie in surprise. "Mud," ejaculated Will tersely. End of chapter 4. Chapter 5 of A Game of Chance by a Self-Made Man. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 5, in which Squire Jarvis visits the Sommers home. The quaint little Dutch timepiece which Captain Fairweather had brought in from Holland some years before, and afterward presented to Nathaniel Sommers, his neighbor, which occupied a conspicuous position on the mantel of the sitting-room in the Sommers home, had just struck the hour of 8, when a loud authoritative knock came on the front door. "I wonder who that can be," said Mrs. Sommers, looking up in mild wonder. Will, who was poring over a new book on practical engineering which he had got from the town public library, jumped up and went to the door. He was surprised and perhaps not a little apprehensive to find that the visitor was none other than the pompous Squire Jarvis. What could be the meaning of this great man's visit to their humble home? "Is Mrs. Sommers at home?" asked the lawyer stiffly. "Yes, sir," replied Will respectfully. "Will you walk in?" Squire Jarvis brushed past the boy with as little consideration as though he was a wooden image, and Mrs. Sommers rose hastily from her chair as his portly form filled the door leading into the sitting-room. "Squire Jarvis!" she exclaimed in surprise. "Yes, ma'am," answered the nabob in a tone that seemed to indicate that he was conferring a distinguished honor on the cottage by his presence there. "Take the rocking-chair," said the lady of the house, pointing to a substantial piece of furniture that was the pride of the house. The squire bowed condescendingly, seated himself, and glanced curiously about the room. Mrs. Sommers reseated herself and waited for the great man to explain the nature of his unexpected call. "Ma'am," began the squire, feeling that what he had to say was not likely to cause a pleasant impression, "I have called in reference to a little matter that has been placed in my hands." Mrs. Sommers bowed and waited for him to proceed. At this moment Will re-entered the room, and took up a position in the background, curious to learn, as he half suspected, if he was the cause of the magnate's visit. He was soon undeceived. "I refer to a note of hand signed by your late husband in favor of Joe Rickson for the sum of $300. The note," continued the squire, fishing out his glasses and poising them with a sort of professional movement upon the bridge of his aristocratic nose, and then taking out a bulky morocco pocketbook, from which he deliberately extracted the document in question, "is dated February 1st, 1895, and expired 1 year from the date, when it became due and payable according to the terms therein expressed. It should have been presented for payment at that time, but your husband having died in the meanwhile, leaving you in somewhat straitened circumstances so far as ready money was concerned, Mr. Rickson refrained from calling immediately on you for the amount owing him, feeling sure you would recognize his claim as soon as you were in a position less financially embarrassing. While this was not business, it reflects a great credit on Mr. Rickson's goodness of heart, a fact, I regret to say, not generally appreciated by his acquaintances. In fact, he has delayed so long in the presentation of this note that it is now within a few months of the time when, according to the laws of the state, it would have become outlawed and consequently worthless. Fortunately, he called my attention to it, and I advised him to collect it at once, and so he turned it over to me for that purpose. Therefore, I should be glad to learn what you are prepared to do about it." Squire Jarvis, having delivered himself of the foregoing in his most impressive manner, he removed his glasses from their perch, and began to twirl them around his index finger while he regarded the little brown-haired widow with a judicial sort of look, possibly with the view of confusing and intimidating her. Mrs. Sommers had listened to him with the utmost amazement, but politely forbore interrupting him. But when he had concluded, she said quietly, "That note was taken up by my husband a few days before his death, and paid." "Paid, madam?" ejaculated the lawyer. "Yes, sir, and Mr. Rickson gave my husband a receipt for the money." "You certainly are laboring under a misapprehension of the facts. If your husband paid this note, it stands to reason it would not now be in the possession of Mr. Rickson. When a note is settled, it is always delivered to the person who drew it, by whom it is, or should be, immediately destroyed." "I think I can account for the fact that it happens to be in Mr. Rickson's possession," said Mrs. Sommers, a slight note of scorn in her tone. "I am ready to hear any explanation you have to make," said the lawyer stiffly. "That he presents it at this late day for repayment does not speak well for the goodness of heart you have just credited him with," said the little lady coldly. "Ma'am," interrupted Squire Jarvis severely, You must not attack the character of such an old and respected citizen as Mr. Rickson." "I was about to explain to you why Mr. Sommers did not get possession of that note at the time he paid the money. The note still had several months to run when he expressed his intention of taking it up. Mr. Rickson at first objected, but when my husband offered him the year's interest, he accepted the money and gave a receipt for the same, saying he would give up the note in a few days as soon as he got it from the bank, where he had deposited it for safekeeping. My husband, promptly feeling that he was protected by the receipt, did not hurry him. In fact, before he may have thought of the matter again, he met with the accident which resulted, unfortunately for himself and family, in his premature death." Mrs. Sommers paused and wiped away a tear. "Your statement is certainly plausible," admitted Squire Jarvis, beginning to fear he had called on a fool's errand after all, and that the unsavory reputation Mr. Rickson bore in town, with which the squire was familiar, was once more cropping up in evidence. "If you have Mr. Rickson's receipt for the $300, of course I shall have nothing more to say. I am not responsible for any act of Mr. Rickson's, ma'am, being merely his agent in the matter. If it is not too much trouble, will you kindly produce the receipt, so that I may convince myself of its genuineness?" "I am sorry to say that the receipt has been mislaid ever since my husband's death," replied Mrs. Sommers, not without some apprehension as to what effect this honest admission would have on the lawyer. "Mislaid, ma'am?" exclaimed the squire, raising his eyebrows in a way that might have implied that he thought such a statement rather thin. "Yes, sir," replied the little widow, with a slight touch of indignation in her voice, for the squire's pantomime had not escaped her. "Very singular," he remarked, tapping the note with his glasses. "Very singular indeed. I hope you don't think I'm not telling the truth," with a quiet scorn that disturbed him. "Not at all, not at all," he replied hastily. "I never doubt a lady's word, but people are often mistaken, ma'am. You—" "There is no mistake in this case, Squire Jarvis," said Mrs. Sommers firmly. "I regret to say that I have not been able to find the receipt. As Mr. Rickson made no effort to recollect the note when it became due, nor at any time during the years that have since elapsed, I naturally presumed it was all right, and gave no further thought to the matter. I must say it is a singular thing for him to present it for payment now, within a few weeks of the time when, as you say, it would have become outlawed. I will not express my opinion as to his motives, but will leave you to judge that yourself." "Well, ma'am," said the wily lawyer, scratching the point of his nose with the rim of his glasses, "it is certainly unfortunate that you cannot produce the receipt. As the case stands, Mr. Rickson has the law on his side, and so, unless you can find the receipt, I am afraid you will have to pay the money over again." "But, sir," cried the widow aghast, "that would be most unjust." "The law, ma'am, passes only upon facts. It has nothing whatever to do with sentiment. People should not be careless. Therein lies the cause of much trouble in this world, that we lawyers are often called upon to unravel, and not always with success. If your husband had insisted upon the immediate return of the note, which was well within his rights, or you had not lost the receipt, which would to all intents and purposes answer the same end, you would not now be in this trouble." "I consider it an outrage that Mr. Rickson should make this demand when he well knows that he was paid once," cried Mrs. Sommers in great indignation. "With that I have nothing whatever to do, ma'am," said the nabob, rising and taking his hat. "I am simply acting on the instructions of my client with the evidence he has produced, and which you seem unable to gainsay. I will give you a week to consider what you will do, at the end of which time I shall expect you to call or send to my office and advise me of your determination." "But I cannot agree to pay that note over again," she said almost tearfully. "In that case, the law will have to take its course." "Do you mean to say, sir, that the law will rob my mother of another $300? demanded Will, facing the magnate of Northport. Squire Jarvis glared at the boy as though astonished at the lad's audacity in addressing him so boldly. "I mean to say, young man, that your mother will have to go to court and show cause why judgment on this note, together with interest to date, shall not be rendered in favor of Mr. Rickson. If she loses, which she is bound to do, unless she produces the alleged receipt, she will also have to pay the costs of the action, which will raise the total amount to something over $450. And if we refuse to pay that?" said the boy with flashing eyes. The lawyer shrugged his shoulders. "This property, which is in your mother's name, will be sold to satisfy the judgment, and the expenses of the sale, with the sheriff's fees, will also be added to the sum I have mentioned. You shall find it a costly matter to fight against the law. I advise you not to try it." Thus speaking, Squire Jarvis walked majestically toward the front door, and Will, oppressed by a sense of utter helplessness to resist the swindle about to be perpetuated on his mother, followed and let him out. End of Chapter 5. Chapter 6 of A Game of Chance by a Self-Made Man. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 6. The Strange Visitor to the Tool House. "What shall we do, my son?" asked Mrs. Sommers in a troubled voice when Will returned to the sitting room. "I don't know, Mother. I suppose you'll have to consult a lawyer. I never believed Mr. Rickson to be such a contemptible swindler," he added bitterly. "He is certainly trying to do us a grievous wrong," said his mother sadly. "Mother, why did Father borrow $300 from Mr. Rickson?" "Because he wished to secure a strip of ground belonging to the Peasley estate, which lay between the end of our property and the river. He had long tried to get possession of it, for small as it was, he knew that it would more than double the value of our own land by giving it a water frontage. Until old Mr. Peasley died, the strip of ground was not for sale. The chance to purchase it was suddenly offered to your father, and rather than lose the opportunity, which might not have occurred again, he decided to raise the amount on his note. A contract which he completed just before he was struck down enabled him to return the money to Mr. Rickson before the note matured. Your father was not a suspicious man. He credited others with the same honesty he himself possessed. That's why he did not insist on Mr. Rickson giving up that note immediately. Had he lived, of course, things would have been different. Mr. Rickson never would have dared." "I should say not," said Will indignantly. "He thinks that because he has a woman to deal with, he can take undue advantage of the situation." "You have no idea where that receipt went to, then, Mother?" "Unfortunately, I have not." "You must make a thorough search of the house at once, and I will get Jessie to help you." "I will do so, of course. It would be a great misfortune if this property was taken from us to satisfy such an unjust claim." "Don't worry, Mother. It shall not be taken from you." "You speak hopefully, my son, but I fear we are in a sad predicament." "There, Mother, we'll let the thing drop for tonight. You look for the paper tomorrow. If it hasn't turned up by the time I come home after work, I'll step over to the Fairweathers and ask Jessie to lend you a hand." At this point the Dutch clock struck 10, and presently mother and son retired for the night. The window of Will's room overlooked the river, on whose surface the old October moon shined with a chilly glitter. As Will stood a moment gazing out upon the landscape, he saw what he thought to be a small boat, with a single occupant moving cautiously up the river. "Gee," he said, "rather a cold night to be on the water. I wonder who it is." The boat approached the Sommers landing place. The occupant fastened a line to one of the spile heads and jumped ashore. Then he began to slouch along beside the fence that divided the Sommers property from that of the Fairweathers. "Who the dickens is he? And what is he up to?" Will asked himself as the figure cautiously drew near to the house. "I don't like his looks for a cent," commented the boy as the intruder paused close to a tall oak tree. An ray of moonlight shone on his face which, though young, looked even at that distance hard and uninviting. The intruder took out a small black pipe which he deliberately filled with tobacco from a pouch, and then glided behind the tree and sat on the ground, for the glare of a lighted match showed his position. For 15 minutes thereafter, all that betrayed his presence was the occasional whiff of whitish smoke that floated about the oak as the fellow puffed at his pipe. Will, now decidedly interested in the stranger's movements, felt no desire to go to bed. "I'd give something to know what he means by sitting out there under our oak tree on a cold night like this. He doesn't appear to be any too warmly dressed, either. Something evidently is in the wind. Does he propose to try to break into our house or the Fairweathers a little later on? I fancy he'll get an unexpected and warm reception if he tries it." At this stage of his reflections, the intruder suddenly reappeared around the tree and began a critical survey of the Sommers premises. Then he deliberately walked over to a small tool house, stocked with implements formerly used by Mr. Sommers when he was alive, and which, since his death, had not been touched. He tried the door. It was found to be locked, of course. After considering a moment, the fellow hauled a tall chopping block up against the side of the shed, mounted it, and pushed in the only window the building had. Then he climbed into the opening and disappeared inside. "I guess it's time for me to interfere," said Will resolutely. "I don't believe he's gone in there to sleep, and I'm not going to have any of my father's things stolen if I can help it." So, taking his shoes in his hands so as not to awaken his mother, he crept down to the kitchen, which overlooked the tool house. "I'll wait here and see what transpires," said the boy, putting on his shoes so as to be in readiness to pop out suddenly into the yard. Will was an uncommonly strong and fearless lad, with the most unbound confidence in his own powers. That the intruder might carry a concealed weapon did not occur to him at the moment. Will waited a good quarter of an hour before there were any further developments. Then the visitors had reappeared at the window, and with remarkable agility he swung himself through the opening and dropped to the ground. Will saw the handles of several short tools protruding from his side pockets. "That settles it. I've got to stop him. Now how in the name of wonder did he know that was a tool house? One would think he was familiar with our place, yet so far as I can judge he seems to be a perfect stranger in this locality." As the stranger started off for the open gate, Will softly opened the kitchen door and attempted to cut him off from the street. His sudden appearance on the scene startled the intruder for a moment, and he stood stock still. Each had a plain view of the other in the moonlight. "Will Sommers!" ejaculated the young fellow, beginning to back away. His voice had such a familiar ring that the boys stopped and regarded him keenly. The closer view and the bright moonshine did the rest. "Ed Rickson!" Will exclaimed in astonishment. "You back? Well, what of it?" replied the fellow with a snarl. "Ain't this where I live when I'm at home?" "What were you doing in our tool house just now?" demanded the boy aggressively. "I didn't think you were a thief, Ed Rickson. Your father wouldn't like to know what you've been up to." "My father!" He had reached the fence by this time and laid one hand on it. The two words were uttered with a sneering intonation not pleasant to hear. "Yes, your father," repeated Will, greatly surprised at young Rickson's manner. "Good night." And with a mocking laugh, Ed Rickson vaulted the paling and darted off down the deserted street at a high rate of speed. It was useless for Will to think of following him. Indeed, once he had recognized Ed Rickson, he had no great desire to do so. After watching his dwindling figure disappear in the gloom, Will went back to the tool house, mounted the block, struck a match, and looked inside. He saw that the lid of one of the chests had been forced open. "I'll investigate closer in the morning and see what you've taken, Ed Rickson," he said as he closed the window and removed the chopping block. 15 minutes later he was in bed, wondering over the strange return to Northport of the black sheep of the Rickson family, and trying to surmise what he was up to at that unseasonable hour of the night. End of Chapter 6. Chapter 7 of A Game of Chance by a Self-Made Man. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 7, in which Tessie Rickson springs a trap on Jessie Fairweather, and how it worked. The operating room of the Northport cotton mills was in full swing. At least 100 busy girls were employed in that room, and the majority of them had their eyes cocked up at the big clock which hung within sight of all, for the long hand pointed to 1:12. Way down in the engine room in the corner of the big yard, Will Sommers was also watching a smaller timepiece, while one of his hands was raised, his fingers gripping the cord that would in another moment send forth a welcome blast, releasing every one of the mill's employees from work for 1 hour. At that interesting moment, Tessie Rickson, who had been to the dressing-room, rushed up to one of the forewomen in a state of great excitement.
"Oh, Miss McBoyle, somebody has taken my pocketbook," she said hysterically.
"What's that?" said the forewoman sharply. She was a stout, red-faced woman whom none of the girls liked because she was such a crank. Jessie Fairweather in particular was a target for Miss Boyle's ill temper, because she took very little notice of the woman's outbursts, and also because she was so pretty and such a general favorite.
"Somebody has taken my pocketbook,"
repeated Tessie in a voice sufficiently loud to attract attention.
"Nonsense,"
snapped Miss McBoyle.
"It's really so,"
persisted the red-haired girl with a great show of earnestness.
"You'd mislaid it somewhere." "No, I didn't, Miss McBoyle. I know I left it in the pocket of my jacket in the dressing-room."
"Well, what do you expect me to do about it?" grunted the forewoman.
"I wish you'd come and help me find it."
"The idea! Don't you think I've something else to do, Miss Rickson?"
"Oh, dear, I don't know what I shall do,"
piped Tessie tearfully. At that moment off went the whistle, and the girls throughout the room began to flock at once toward the dressing-rooms. "Well, come along," said Miss McBoyle rather ungraciously.
"Somebody must have taken it out of my pocket," insinuated Tessie.
"I don't believe it," replied the forewoman.
"Well, I wouldn't trust that Fairweather girl as
she is such a favorite," said Tessie vindictively. At this, Miss McBoyle cocked up her ears.
"What makes you think she might do such a thing?" "Oh, I've my reasons,"
said Miss Rickson, tossing her hair disdainfully.
"Well, I must say I don't fancy her myself,"
sniffed the forewoman. Tessie knew that, and began to throw out insinuations against the fair Jessie.
"I'd search her dress if I was you,"
said Miss Rickson eagerly. For reasons of her own, the forewoman was ready to adopt this unfair plan, for she was only too eager to humiliate the belle of the factory, so she snatched down the girl's walking dress from the hook just as its owner entered the room with a bevy of her friends.
"Why, Miss McBoyle, that's my dress,"
protested Jessie as the woman thrust her coarse red hand into the pocket of the dress, much to Tessie's delight.
"I believe it is,"
snapped the forewoman as she brought a small pocketbook to the light.
"There! I told you she took it,"
screamed Tessie.
"That's my pocketbook."
"What have you got to say to this, Miss Fairweather?" asked Miss McBoyle with a triumphant ring to her voice. "Are you in the habit of taking things that don't belong to you?"
"I don't understand, Miss McBoyle,"
replied Jessie with dignity.
"Indeed.
Perhaps you can explain how Miss Rickson's pocketbook happened to be in the pocket of your dress." The other girls crowding around stared in astonishment.
"I haven't the slightest idea how such a thing occurred,
unless Miss Rickson put it there herself by mistake."
"The idea!"
sniffed Tessie with a scornful glance at her intended victim.
"She accuses you of stealing it from her,"
said the forewoman severely.
"Accuses me of stealing her pocketbook?"
gasped Jessie, flushing with mortification at such a charge.
"Yes, miss, and as the article has been found in your possession, I shall have to inform the superintendent,"
said Miss McBoyle in a tone of satisfaction.
"I had no idea we had a thief in the mill."
"Miss McBoyle, how dare you insinuate such a thing?" cried Jessie, tears of indignation coming into her pretty eyes.
"It's a shame,"
chorused the other girls.
"Jessie wouldn't do such a thing."
"You're mad because you've been caught in the act," sneered the forewoman. "I always thought you were a sly thing with your innocent airs and prudish ways. You ought to be ashamed of yourself."
"Girls, do you believe me capable of such a thing?"
cried Jessie, appealing with burning cheeks and flashing eyes to her working mates.
"No!"
they shouted with one accord.
"How can you accuse Jessie of taking your property, Jessie Rickson?"
cried one spirited girl, putting her arm around Jessie Fairweather.
"Well, it was found on her, all right,"
said Tessie spitefully.
"I believe you put it there yourself, just to get her into trouble,"
cried another girl, coming to Jessie's aid.
"The idea!"
retorted Jessie angrily.
"You can believe what you like, Clara Parks, but I've my own opinion. It isn't the first thing I've missed. Some people put on a lot of airs when they ain't no better than—" "Than what, Tessie Rickson?" said Jessie, walking up to her accuser and looking her squarely in the eye. "You needn't try to intimidate me, Miss Make-Believe,"
replied Tessie scornfully.
"You may soft-shoulder the rest of the girls, but you can't draw the wool over my eyes. You are a deceitful thing. I know you talk about me behind my back. Say I have carroty hair, that my mouth is large enough to swallow snowballs, and I'm all bones. I hate you. There." And Miss Rickson, with tears of rage in her green eyes, marched out of the room, leaving Jessie almost paralyzed with pained astonishment. Miss McBoyle had in the meanwhile gone down to the superintendent's office to register the charge of attempted theft against Miss Fairweather. "What must you girls think of me?" exclaimed Jessie, breaking down at last under the strain of the terrible position in which she was placed. "I know what I think," cried one of her devoted adherents. "You're the best and sweetest girl I ever knew," and the speaker kissed Jessie tenderly. "It's a shame," said Miss Parks indignantly. "It's more than that," cried a little brunette. "It's an outrage. I move we have nothing more to do with Tessie Rickson." "I say so, too," cried another girl. "And I, and I, and I." The whole bunch agreed. "We'll fix her, the hateful thing," cried Miss Parks. "It's a put-up job of her own. As for Miss Vinegary McBoyle, she only wanted an excuse to jump on Jessie. She is forever picking at her anyway. Now, don't cry, dear. We're all your friends, and we're just going to stand by you right up to the handle, as my brother calls it. Aren't we, girls?" "Yes," in chorus. "You're very kind, all of you," sobbed Jessie. "But you don't know how mortified I feel at being called a thief, just as if I could take a value of a pin from anyone. Oh, dear, it's terrible. If I was you, I would go right straight to the superintendent and demand justice," cried Miss Parks. "And we'll all go with you," exclaimed the rest. And the result of it was that Jessie did march straight down to the superintendent's office and stated the case, and every one of her friends insisted on being heard in her behalf. Mr. Harper smiled good-naturedly. "Miss McBoyle made a sort of charge against you, Miss Fairweather, but I laughed her down. I bless you, young lady. I'd as soon think one of my own daughters guilty of such a thing as you. There, now don't cry, please. I take no stock in it at all. It's simply ridiculous. Go home, all of you, to your dinners, and I'll allow you half an hour extra today, under the circumstances, as you've lost that much time over this silly affair." And Miss Rickson, when she returned to work that afternoon, found to her great disgust and mortification that not a girl in the room would notice her. End of Chapter 7. Chapter 8 of A Game of Chance by a Self-Made Man. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 8 For the Sake of Her Enemy. A great deal of sympathy was expressed by the girls of Northport Cotton Mills for Jessie Fairweather that afternoon, while at the same time, if Miss McBoyle and Tessie Rickson could have heard all the remarks passed upon their conduct over the pocketbook affair, they would not have been a bit pleased. News of that nature is bound to spread, and it was not long before the intelligence reached the engine-room. "Now, what do you think of that?" cried Will Sommers after one of the kids of the establishment had told him all about the dressing-room trouble. This remark was made to Mr. Davis, the engineer, who, pipe in mouth, had been quietly listening to the story. "A jealous girl is capable of doing a great deal of mischief," said the engineer sagely. "Well, I should say so, but only a very spiteful, reckless girl would put up such a mean job as that," said Will angrily. Mr. Davis nodded. "But, of course, there isn't any doubt but she was at the bottom of the scheme," went on Will, "though the fact hasn't actually been shown. But from the way Billy says the girls are handing it out to Miss Rickson this afternoon, it's evident that they all believe she's guilty of the plot. And wouldn't you think that a woman like Miss McBoyle would easily have seen through such a thin device?" Whatever the engineer thought on the subject, he did not express it in words, but he made a pretty shrewd guess at the forewoman's motives. "This latest contrivance of yours, which I attached to the boiler yesterday afternoon, seems to be working all right," said Mr. Davis. "Is that a fact, sir?" answered Will with sparkling eyes. The engineer nodded. "You've got some good ideas in that brain of yours, young man," continued Mr. Davis approvingly. "I'm satisfied you could pass examination for a stationary engineer's license." "Thank you for your good opinion, Mr. Davis. I'm sure I owe a large part of my proficiency to your instruction and encouragement," replied Will gratefully. "That may be," admitted the engineer,
But if it was not in you, my endeavors would have been wasted. There is a heap of satisfaction in helping a young fellow along when you know he's trying his best to take advantage of his opportunities. All boys are not as clever as you are. Too many of them are ambitious to do great things for which they have no ability, but are not inclined to do little things for which they alone are capable. Now, for instance, that, however, was as far as the engineer got in this occasion, for at that instant there came to their ears a shrill scream from the direction of the factory building. "Something's wrong!" exclaimed Will, springing to the open doorway. Yes, something was wrong. The third-story windows of the operating room were filled with the screaming girls, above whose heads a thin film of smoke was sifting out in the afternoon air. "Fire! Fire! Fire!" wailed the girls from point to point. "Great Scott!" shouted Will back to the engineer as he dashed out of the doorway. "I believe the factory's on fire." All the men employees working about the yard started for the imperiled building, into the main entrance of which Superintendent Harper, hatless and excited, had just disappeared. 2 or 3 girls came bursting out from the employees' entrance, falling faint upon one another in a heap, and were speedily dragged up and carried several yards away by some of the men. Then a crowd of workers from the ground and second floors came rushing out. On the far side of the factory, that which overlooked the street, Will saw a huge volume of dark smoke mingled with spurts of flame rising above the level of the roof. "The place is on fire, sure enough," he cried as he hurried forward. "But why in creation don't the girls chase themselves down the main stairway?" The reason for this was apparent when the boy entered the building and had mounted to the second floor. The stairs leading to the small corridor on the next floor, and which communicated with the main fire escape on the front of the building, was a mass of flames. The upper passage was choked by a dense smoke that blocked any attempt to reach the fire escape in question. All retreat from the operating room by the main avenues of escape was cut off. "Great Caesar!" exclaimed Will, aghast at the peril which menaced the employees on the upper floor. "The girls will have to hustle down the emergency iron stairways at the ends of the building." "Where's the hose?" hoarsely shouted Mr. Harper at the foot of the burning stairs. "We're bringing one up, sir," replied a burly yardman from below, who, with the help of a companion, was dragging a length of fire hose which had just been attached to the hydrant outside the back door. Will saw he could be of no use where he was, and anxious for the safety of the girls and that of Jessie Fairweather in particular, he ran back to the yard in time to see a long ladder planted against the wall of the factory, beneath one of the windows that was crowded with screaming girls. The men were shouting to the girls to go to the ends of the building and come down the iron stairs, but so rattled were the poor things that only a few were seen to take advantage of these exits. "Let me go up the ladder," and Will started at once to ascend, with the view of calming the panic that was raging on the top floor. The ladder was too short to reach the level of the window, but by carefully balancing himself on the topmost rung, Will grasped the window sill and scrambled into the long operating room, forcing back a dozen girls who blocked the way. "Why don't you go to the end of the room?" cried the boy to the terrified young women. "You can all get down by the iron stairways if you only go about it right." But it was a difficult matter to bring order out of the pandemonium which now existed on the top floor, and small wonder that it was so, for the place was growing hazy with smoke, and the sinister roar of the flames in the corridor outside was terrifying to the girls, who could see the fire through the cracks in the blazing partition. Will began forcing the groups of employees toward the other end of the building, never for a moment ceasing to shout to them how they could get out, until at last he got the tide set in both directions, and the girls then began to stream down the iron stairways, encouraged by workmen on the several landings and on the ground below. By this time a stream of water was turned on the fire, but the blaze had got too much headway to be subdued by one line of hose. However, help was coming from the outside. The town fire department, 3 engine companies, were now rushing to the scene as fast as the horses could bring them. Will, working like a beaver for the safety of the girls, had not recognized Jessie among the crowd, which had by this time thinned down to a dozen or 2, waiting their chance in fear and trembling to get to the iron stairs. "She must have got out all right," he thought thankfully as he saw the last of the girls passing through the end windows of the smoky room. "Gee, it's getting pretty hot up here now, all right. The fire's got hold of the dressing room, I see. The girls will lose all their clothes, but better that than their lives. Time for me to go, I guess." At this moment, one of the sides of the partition separating the operating room from the corridor fell in with a crash, and Will had a clear view of the blazing stairway beyond. It was like looking into a fiery furnace. The flames were in full control of the end of the dressing room on the other side. As he started for one of the iron stairways himself, tears in his eyes from the effects of the smoke, and his throat parched and smarting from the same cause, he suddenly stopped short within a few yards of the blazing dressing room. The hurried glance he had cast in that direction showed him a human hand and part of an arm thrust through the half-open doorway. "Great heavens!" he cried. "Some poor girl has fainted in there. I must save her at any cost." Dropping on his knees to escape the stifling air as much as possible, he crawled rapidly over to the door of the dressing room. Pushing the door wide open, he saw in the red glare of the blaze that now had full possession of the room 2 insensible girls, one of whom, who seemed to have been in the act of dragging her companion away from peril when she herself had been overcome, he recognized with a thrill of horrified surprise as Jessie Fairweather. The other was Jessie's bitter enemy, Tessie Rickson. Will took in the situation at a glance. "You're a noble girl, Jessie," he murmured as he seized hold of her hand and released the grip she had on Tessie. "But that I saw you by the merest accident. You would have lost your life for the sake of the girl who tried to ruin you this morning." He dragged her several yards away, and then returned for Tessie, the hem of whose skirt was now on fire. He beat out the fire and carried her forward a short distance toward safety. Alternately, he worked the senseless girls toward the end of the long room, with the flames now in control of the floor reaching out hungrily after him. Staggering along, grasping for breath and dizzy from the heat, he slowly drew them nearer to the opening connecting with the fire escape. End of Chapter 8. Chapter 9 of A Game of Chance by a Self-Made Man. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 9. In the Name of the Law. A big crowd had gathered outside in the street by this time. The engines were getting into position, and the firemen were bringing up their hose in readiness to turn on a number of streams on the blazing factory, the upper floor of which on the dressing-room side was rapidly being gutted by the flames. The fire now having a good headway, it was playing hijinks with that end of the building. Everybody was believed to have got out of the danger zone, and all efforts were centered on saving as much of the factory as possible. Great, then, was the astonishment of the crowd that had a clear view of that end of the building when a human figure stumbled out onto the platform of the narrow fire escape stairs. Then he seemed to pull himself together, but to everybody's surprise, instead of running down the escape, he dashed back into the burning floor. "He's mad!" cried a spectator. "Plumb crazy," said another. "Who is he?" asked a third. No one knew at this time, for no one had clearly seen his face. 2 of the firemen started up the fire escape. Before they reached the platform, Will again appeared at the opening, this time with a burden in his arms. "Hurrah!" shrieked the mob in a paroxysm of enthusiasm. Propping the girl, who was Jessie Fairweather, against the railing, Will vanished into the smoke once more. The crowd seemed to realize what was meant. "There's more inside," was passed from mouth to mouth, and all grew quiet with apprehension. "There he is!" cried one eagerly, pointing at the opening, which was now more obscure than ever from the smoke. Another simultaneous yell went up from the crowd as Will staggered forth, bearing Tessie Rickson in his arms. By that time the firemen had reached the upper landing. One of them picked up Miss Fairweather, while the other relieved Will of Tessie Rickson, and down the ladder they went, followed by the boy, whose face and hands were black from the stains of smoke and blistered by the heat. The surging mob shouted its appeal and experienced a great feeling of relief. While the superintendent was ringing Bill by one hand, the vice president of the company who had arrived on the ground was shaking him by the other, and both were telling him what a brave young fellow he was. At the same time a crowd of employees of both sexes gathered around the group. "It's Will Sommers!" cried those in a position to see, and his name was passed about from one to another until everybody in the yard knew what the boy had accomplished. "Isn't he grand?" exclaimed one girl. "Why, he's a real hero," said another. "He saved Jessie Fairweather, and that Rickson girl, too. And just look at his face, the poor fellow." Such was the tenor of remarks in a crowd around Will, who finally made a dive through his admirers and made his way to the engine room, at the door of which stood the engineer. In the meantime, Jessie Fairweather and Tessie Rickson had been taken by the hand by sympathizing friends and brought to their senses. At first, Tessie hardly knew whether she was glad or sorry to find herself alive. This may seem like an odd statement to make, but then Tessie had her reasons. In the first place, she had been the cause of the fire. She had been enraged by the way the girls had treated her that afternoon, for all of them suspected that she was at the bottom of the pocketbook affair, and for the purpose of getting square she had deliberately gone into the dressing room and set fire to several of the dresses in one corner of the room. In her anger, she did not reflect that she was endangering the building, her idea being to destroy the clothes of those girls who had been particularly conspicuous in their hostile attitude toward her. But she had unwittingly selected a particularly inflammable part of the room, a place where the partition leading against the stairs had been oil-soaked with drippings from a hanger that supported one of the cross shafts. Consequently, the fire spread to the landing outside with great rapidity. When the alarm was given, she ran to the dressing rooms to save her own clothes, but was overcome with terror and heat just as Jessie appeared on the scene, and her last recollections were of the brave and unselfish efforts the girl she had injured was making to save her from a fate she was powerless to escape. She hated to think she actually owed her life to Jessie Fairweather. When the two girls learned their escape was due to gallant Will Sommers, they expressed themselves in different ways, characteristic of their dispositions. Jessie had little to say, while deeply grateful to Will, but Tessie raved over the affair because it was so like the hero and heroine in the story papers she was accustomed to read. While the Northport Fire Department was doing its best to get the flames under control, Will Sommers interviewed a bucket of water and a bar of Castile soap, which, with the assistance of a crash towel, soon made him presentable again. Many admiring friends gathered at the engine room to congratulate him personally. "Oh, come now," he remonstrated good-naturedly. "Let up on a fellow, won't you? I didn't do such an awful lot when you come to look at it in the face. I simply found the girls lying at the door of the dressing room, and you don't suppose anyone but a savage without a grain of feeling would have left them there to perish, do you? Any one of you fellows would have done exactly as I did under the circumstances. So what's the use of making all this fuss about it? I'm glad I got 'em out, so that's all there is to it." "Oh, I don't know," remarked a big operator who worked on the ground floor. "Many boys, or men for that matter, would have thought of number one first of all, and not have taken the chances you did. At any rate, you're all right, Will." "Bet your life he is," said another husky fellow admiringly. "You're the real article, young man," spoke up one of the foremen. "Every day I hear people blow about what they can do or have done, but I like to talk to a party who I know has done something worthwhile and isn't blowing off about it afterward." "You hit the nail on the head that time, Buckley," said another employee. "There's one thing certain," grinned the fifth. "You've got all the girls dead rights this trip. They'll rave over you for a month." "Say, don't," objected Will with a laugh. "I've only got one-size hats to my name, and I don't want you fellows to swell my head up so I can't wear 'em." "No fear of that," said the foreman. "You aren't built that way." "Is Will Sommers here?" asked a voice on the outside at this juncture. "Sure he is," somebody was heard to say. "What do you want with him, officer? He ain't been stealing some girl's heart, has he?" With a loud guffaw. As all hands looked toward the doorway, the head constable of Northport entered the engine room. "How do you do, Will Sommers? I'm sorry to say my errand is an unpleasant one, but I have to do my duty. I have a warrant for your arrest." This unexpected announcement created a profound sensation among those present. End of Chapter 9. Chapter 10 of A Game of Chance by a Self-Made Man. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 10, in which Squire Jarvis fails to make a case against Will Sommers. "What do you mean, Mr. Brady?" gasped Will Sommers in the greatest astonishment. "I'm sorry my duty obliges me to take you my prisoner, but I don't see any way out of it. I'll have to conduct you before Justice Benson." "But I haven't done anything for which I should be arrested," remonstrated Will. "I hope you haven't," replied the constable. "It is quite possible some mistake has been made, in which case you will be immediately released." "There certainly is a mistake," said the boy stoutly. "You don't look at all like a guilty boy," said the constable with a smile. "I should think not. All right, I'm ready to face the music. What's the charge, Mr. Brady?" asked Mr. Davis, the engineer. "I regret to say it's a very serious one," replied the officer soberly. "You don't mean to say this boy is accused of murdering somebody, do you?" said the engineer with a contemptuous laugh. "Hardly as bad as that," answered the officer, who saw that officially he was not favorably regarded by Will's friends. "Well, what am I charged with?" asked the boy. "Burglary. I believe you might have knocked Will, and the whole crowd for that matter, down with a feather at that moment." "Burglary? Why, it was ridiculous. Who made such a preposterous charge against this boy?" demanded Mr. Davis. "Squire Jarvis." That was a second surprise, but it was evidently a serious one. Surely the magnate of Northport would not make such an accusation without some ground to base it on. No one had heard that a burglary had been committed on the Jarvis premises. But suppose such had been the case, in what way was Will Sommers, one of the brightest and most respected lads in town, connected with it? That was the question each one of the engine-room asked himself as he looked at Will's honest face and then at the officer. "I suppose you have a warrant with you?" asked Mr. Davis. "I have," answered the constable. "Do you wish to see it?" "Yes." Constable Brady produced it, and the engineer found it was made out in proper form. "I shall be ready to go along with you as soon as I get out of my working clothes," said Will. "But I guess the squire will find he has made a serious blunder in bringing this charge against me. Well, I hope you'll get out of it all right. It's no pleasure for me to come after you in my official capacity. Your father was a good friend of mine, and this job is not at all to my liking. I have no fault to find with you, Constable Brady," said the boy as he slipped off his overalls. In a few moments he was ready to go with the officer. So, while the factory fire, which was now under control, held the attention of almost everybody in the vicinity, Will Sommers and Constable Brady left the yard by a back gate and proceeded to the courthouse, where the officer and the justice was waiting to hold a sort of informal examination of the charge. Will was conducted to Justice Benson's office and directed to take a seat. Besides Mr. Benson, the most prominent person in the room was Squire Jarvis, who gave the prisoner a severe, uncompromising look. The gardener of the Jarvis establishment was also present. "Will Sommers, I'm sorry to have you brought before me on a criminal charge, especially one so serious as a warrant indicates. But I have no doubt you will be able to clear yourself, at least I trust so." And Justice Benson looked kindly at the manly young fellow whom he had known from his infancy, and who did not at all look like a boy capable of committing an unworthy action. Squire Jarvis sniffed at Mr. Benson's encouraging view of the situation, and thumped the floor with his gold-headed cane, as though to express his disapprobation. "I want you to understand, Master Sommers, that this examination is entirely informal," continued the justice, "and that you are not compelled to say a word unless you choose to do so. But if you do say anything, I warn you that you are not obliged to commit yourself, and that whatever you say may be used against you." "If he wants to confess, he had better do it now," said the magnate impatiently. "You are rather hasty, Squire Jarvis. The boy has not yet been informed in detail of the charge against him." "Pooh! He knows about it better than any of us," sneered the nabob, casting a black look at Will. "Squire Jarvis, that remark is hardly a fair one," objected the justice, who was clearly favorably disposed toward the prisoner. "Pooh!" said the lawyer, and the lawyer thumped the floor once more. "Listen to me, Master Sommers," said Justice Benson. "Between the hours of 11 last night and 6 this morning, Squire Jarvis's office, an extension of his residence, was forcibly entered. His desk pried open, and several papers, including a $10 bill, were abstracted. You are charged with the crime. Do you wish to make any statement?" "I wish to say I know nothing whatever about the matter. This is the first I've heard of it. I was in bed and asleep between the hours mentioned." This general denial of the charge was received by the squire and his son, who was also present, with sneering disapproval. "Then," remarked the justice, if this case ever comes up in court, you ought to be able to prove an alibi." "I think the prisoner would find it a rather difficult matter to prove to the satisfaction of a judge and jury that he was in bed every moment of the time within which it was possible for him to commit this crime," said the squire acidly. "You seem to be greatly prejudiced against this boy," observed Justice Benson. "Huh!" snorted the nabob, moving about in his chair. Mr. Benson took up a hammer and a cold chisel, which had been lying on his desk, and asked the constable to hand them to Will. "Have you ever seen these implements before?" he inquired. The boy looked them over and answered promptly, "Yes, sir. They belong to my father, for his name is upon them." "Can you assign any reason for their having been found this morning on the floor of Squire Jarvis's office?" "The only explanation I can offer is this. They were abstracted from our tool house last night about 11 o'clock by Ed Rickson." "Who?" demanded Squire Jarvis, jumping to his feet. "Ed Rickson. What tomfoolery is this? He hasn't been in this neighborhood since 2 years back," snorted the nabob angrily. "I know that," answered Will calmly, "but the fact that I saw him enter our tool house last night through the window and leave with something in his pocket shows that he has returned." "I don't believe any such rot," said the great man rudely. "Softly, Squire Jarvis. You should not attack the lad's veracity in this way. He is entitled to make whatever explanation he sees fit, and it is quite possible that he speaks the truth. Go on, Master Sommers. I tried to head him off, but he jumped the fence and got away. If Ed Rickson had come back to town, I fancy I should have heard of it," said the magnate with an incredulous smile, "for I was speaking to Mr. Rickson at noon today, and he made no mention of the circumstance. You cannot be ignorant of the fact that Edward Rickson did not bear a very good reputation while he lived in Northport," said Justice Benson meaningly. "If we accept Master Sommers' statement of his encounter with that young man last night, it certainly casts a shade of suspicion in a direction it might be well to follow up. If Edward Rickson did enter the Sommers tool house, as the accused asserts, and I presume he is willing to swear to it in court," and the magistrate glanced inquiringly at Will. "Yes, sir," answered the boy promptly. "Then," continued the justice, "he must have had some object in doing so. Had the object been a worthy one, it seems to me the owner of the tool house would have been consulted. As the tools found in your house this morning have been identified by the accused as the property of his family, and it has not been shown that Master Sommers carried them there himself, why the inference—" "I beg to say that we are not dealing with inferences," said the squire stiffly. "Can you prove that the accused entered your office with those tools?" asked Justice Benson rather sharply. "If I could, there would be no necessity for this rigmarole," replied the squire a bit disconcerted. "But I can show with sufficient clearness that this Sommers boy had a well-defined object in breaking into my place and rifling my desk, from which I presume you draw an inference of his guilt," said the justice with a smile, laying stress on the word inference, much to the nabob's annoyance. "I believe it will establish a strong presumption in that direction," persisted the great man. "I will hear what you have to say, Squire Jarvis," said Justice Benson quietly. "The only thing of importance taken from my desk," proceeded the nabob, punctuating his sentences with a downward movement of his extended index finger, "was a certain paper, or, to be more explicit, a note of hand deposited with me yesterday by Mr. Job Rickson for collection. This paper would not be of the slightest use or value to Ed Rickson, assuming for the sake of illustration that it was he who broke into my office. But, sir, its destruction would be of the greatest importance to the pecuniary interest of the Sommers family, inasmuch as it represents an unsettled claim against their property." "Mr. Benson," interrupted Will, springing to his feet, "I deny Squire Jarvis's statement that the note to which he refers represents an unsettled claim against my mother. The note was paid by my father before his death, and the attempt now made by Mr. Rickson through Squire Jarvis to collect it over again is a rank swindle." "Master Sommers," said the justice mildly. "You must not interrupt Squire Jarvis while he is speaking. Whatever you have to say about this matter I will hear after the squire has finished. The note in question," continued the magnate, casting a supercilious glance at the boy, "is a promissory one for the sum of $300 drawn in favor of Joe Brixton and signed by Nathaniel Sommers. Together with unpaid interest to date, it represents a perfectly legal claim against the drawer's estate of $425. This is the vital point I wish to impress upon your attention, Mr. Benson. The other papers, as well as the $10 bill, I believe were merely taken as a blind. It is fortunate that the thief, owing to the hurry of the moment, perfectly natural to one unaccustomed to the commission of a crime, forgot to take away the implements he brought with him to accomplish his object. I believe you have a safe in your office, Squire Jarvis?" said the justice. "I have. I should think, then, that it would have been the proper place for you to have kept that note. I can explain why I did not have it in the safe last night," said the lawyer pompously. "I called with that note on Mrs. Sommers last evening about 8 o'clock for the purpose of arranging with her as to its payment. And Mother contested it on the ground that it had already been paid once, a fact we could prove only that the receipt had been mislaid or lost," broke in Will impetuously. "Go on, Squire Jarvis," said Mr. Benson, overlooking the interruption. "It was rather late when I returned home, and not caring to take the trouble to unlock my safe, I opened my desk and slipped it into one of the pigeonholes. I naturally had no suspicion that anyone was likely to break into my office during the night. Certainly no one interested in that particular bit of paper. It seems I was mistaken," concluded the lawyer grimly as he sat down again. "That is all you have to say, Squire?" "That is all. I think it is conclusive," gazing around with a satisfied expression, "when taken in connection with the testimony of my gardener, whom I will now bring forward." Jobbings, the gardener, testified to the following facts: that he had found the outside door of the Squire Jarvis's office ajar that morning at 6 o'clock, and on examination found that it had clearly been broken in by a cold chisel or similar instrument; that he entered the office and found the evidence that the squire's desk had also been tampered with; that he had found the hammer and cold chisel, which he now identified as the articles in question, on the carpet beside the justice's desk; that he immediately aroused his employer and notified him of the circumstances. "Have you anything further to say, Master Sommers?" asked the justice, gazing at the boy, whose honest face and straightforward manner favorably impressed him. "No, sir," replied Will fearlessly. "I should think not," said Squire Jarvis offensively, glaring at the lad. "I presume you will permit the prisoner to stand trial?" "I am afraid," said Justice Benson, interrupting him, "that the evidence is not sufficient to warrant holding the boy." "Sir!" exclaimed the squire in some astonishment. "I am surprised that you, a lawyer, in view of the lack of evidence, even of a circumstantial nature, should insist on such a course, which, in the event that you afterward failed to make out a true case, would make you liable to be proceeded against in a civil suit for damages. Will Sommers, you are discharged." "Thank you, Mr. Benson." And putting on his hat, he walked out of the justice's office, a very happy boy. End of Chapter 10. Chapter 11 of A Game of Chance by a Self-Made Man. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 11. Further discussions about Will Sommers' game of chance. When Will Sommers got back to the factory that afternoon, he found the fire had been put out and the engines gone. A solitary representative of the fire department stood on guard at the main entrance, and a few curious spectators hung about the neighborhood gazing up at the ruin of the third story. Superintendent Harper and an insurance adjuster were figuring out the loss in the office. All the employees, with the exception of the engineer and a few of the yardmen, had departed. "Hello, Bill!" exclaimed Mr. Davis when the boy walked into the engine room. "Back again, eh? Got out of your scrape all right?" "Yes, sir," answered Will cheerily. "That's good. What was it all about, anyway?" Will told him the whole story. "The squire seems to have it in for you." commented the engineer. I don't seem to be an especial favorite of his, that's a fact, replied the boy with a cheerful grin. That's right, but I wouldn't let that fact worry you, Annie. I don't mean that it shall. Ed Rickson is at the bottom of that affair, said Mr. Davis, nodding his head sagely. He always was a hard nut, said Mr. Davis, but I never knew before that he was a thief. His 2 years' absence had not reformed him, I see. I'm afraid it has only developed his criminal instincts. His father's reputation isn't anything to brag about. This swindle he's trying to work on my mother only serves to confirm my opinion of the man. The idea of him keeping that note all these years in the background, and then ringing it in on us at the last minute on the chance that we couldn't produce the receipt he gave to father for the money. That shows you what kind of a man he is, said the boy indignantly. Squire Jarvis can't but have some suspicion of the truth. It doesn't speak well for him to support a fraud. Mr. Rickson probably promised him a large commission to collect the note. Such a proposal as that should be enough to arouse any lawyer's doubts, especially after your mother affirmed the note had already been paid, and Mr. Rickson had allowed it to run so many years after maturity without presenting it for payment. That's right. It has all the earmarks of a skin on the face of it. Now that the note has disappeared, it is possible you may never hear from it again, suggested the engineer encouragingly. I don't know about that, said Will doubtfully. Ed Rickson may return it to his father, as it is of value to him. He could do that by mail if he's afraid to show himself at his home. What gets me is why he entered the squire's office at all. He couldn't expect to get any money without breaking into the safe, and he certainly was not provided with tools for such a purpose. The $10 bill he got just happened to be in the desk. It would only be wasted time to figure upon what his object was, said the engineer as he relighted his pipe. He had one, no doubt, and it will probably come to light if he should ever be caught. I don't believe the Squire Jarvis will make any complaint against him, intimated Will. His efforts were all directed to fasten the crime on me. Lewis is dead sore on me, too, and I think that's the secret of his father's ill will. Very likely. You might as well go home, Will. It's 4:30, and there's nothing for you to do around here. All right. Guess I'll go and take a look at my dam. It's pretty near time I had it repaired. Say, young man, said the engineer curiously, what are you up to, anyway? What are you going to make out of that swamp lot? You aren't such a fool as to try the same dodge Rickson monkeyed with, are you? What makes you ask? Said Will with a grin. Because I'm curious to learn what your little game is. Rickson figured on making a small fortune out of an ice privilege by damming up the outlet of the swamp and making a swamp out of the 10 acres. The idea was certainly ingenious, but the confirmation of the bog knocked his scheme in the head. He was badly disappointed. The next thing I heard was that you, with all your smartness, had paid him $25 for a clear title to the place, which, in my opinion, isn't worth a cent. I know you said so when I first admitted to you that I had purchased it. But that's where you and I differ. We certainly do, replied the engineer positively. Are you going to fill it in and try to reclaim the land? With a grin. Kind of a foolish thing to attempt, when people say it hasn't any bottom. Those stones you dumped on the frozen surface last winter are probably coming out in China or somewhere else by this time. Better let the place alone and devote your time to engineering where your talent lies. It's possible I may surprise you with that swamp lot yet, Mr. Davis. I'm working a scheme, a sort of game of chance my brain is playing against the perverseness of nature. You ought to know that a large proportion of success in this world is the outcome of chance anyway. Rickson was sure he was going to succeed. When he failed, he threw the whole thing up in disgust, without investigating the cause that threw him down. I didn't get on to it at first myself, but after a little while I saw through it. Then I began to figure out how the real difficulty might be overcome, just as I have worked my brains to try to produce a successful new damper regulator, or my steam condenser, which you have just applied to that boiler, see? The engineer nodded and began to look interested. I may fail and get the grand laugh, continued Will, though his eyes sparkled with enthusiasm of the hopeful endeavor, but I am satisfied I'm working along correct lines. If I fail this winter, the character of the failure will determine whether I shall make another attempt, or let the whole matter go by the board. I have thoroughly investigated the quality and consistency of that swamp grass, That was the most important step in the scheme. Once I was satisfied my idea was feasible, I went ahead. The chief element of chance in my mind lies in the uncertain course nature may pursue when the water is prevented from escaping. You know what occurred the last time this was done? Exactly. My scheme is to offset the repetition of that occurrence. That's a sensible idea, I'll admit. How do you propose to overcome this difficulty? Asked the engineer, now thoroughly interested. That's my secret, Mr. Davis, and I hope you won't feel sore because I prefer to keep you in the dark about it for the present. I've only told one person, and she— Your mother, I suppose, said the engineer. No, I haven't explained the matter to my mother, because if I happen to be successful, I shall be able to work a very pleasant surprise on her. Then who is the she? Asked Mr. Davis tantalizingly. Oh, it's a girl. I didn't suppose the she was a boy, grinned the engineer. I mean, she's a particular friend of mine, said Will, flushing to his hair. Oh, I see. You mean the prettiest girl in the factory, Jessie Fairweather. Well, maybe I do, admitted the boy reluctantly. You needn't be ashamed to acknowledge it, Will Sommers. She's the brightest girl in Northport, just as you are the smartest boy. If I had to pick an out of a girl for you, she'd be the first choice. You two are well matched. I hope one of these days to see— Good night, said Will hastily. I'm off. And the honest old engineer shook with quiet laughter as the boy made a sudden break for the door and disappeared. End of chapter 11. Chapter 12 of A Game of Chance by a Self-Made Man. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 12. Repairing the Dam at the Mouth of the Swamp Lot. For the next day or two, while the first and second stories of the factory were being cleaned up and put into shape for the resumption of work in those departments of the building, Will had nothing to do in the engine room of the Northport cotton mills, so he took advantage of the opportunity to repair the dam at the swamp lot. He did not do this all by himself, but induced a particular friend named Sam Travis to give him a helping hand. They took a number of substantial boards and the necessary tools and went out to the gruesome spot. The water was running freely through the opening Will had made after he had completed his self-imposed job of distributing the heavy stones over the frozen surface of the bog. So you think you'll have a nice privilege for sale this winter, do you, Will? Said Sam Travis with an incredulous grin. It's possible I may, replied Will tersely. Nyeh, ejaculated his companion. Old Rickson tried the experiment last winter, and he got badly roasted. I didn't think you was such a chump as to tackle the same scheme. Well, Sam, we can't all be wise in this world, you know, replied Will with a cheerful laugh. Perhaps I'm only doing this for fun, just to put in my time, you know. Yes, you are like fun, grinned Travis. I see you doing such a thing. No, you mean business, all right. But hang me if I don't give you credit for more brains. Thanks, Sam, for the compliment, said Will with an almost good nature. You're welcome. Well, now since you've had your little say, suppose you get busy. Hand me one of those boards. You stand here and hold your end till I get it straight, and then drive a half a dozen of those nails to hold it in place. All right, old man. Only it's an awful waste of good lumber, nails, and energy. You'll let me be the judge of that, Sam. Sure, it's your funeral, not mine. If you don't watch where you're putting your feet, it may be your funeral first thing you know, said Will with a grin, as one of Sam's legs slipped and went down into the ooze in a very unpleasant manner. Thanks for the warning, old chappie. But I'm not taking a mud bath today, snickered Sam with a rueful look at the bottom of his trousers leg. Mud baths, they say, are good for rheumatism. Then old Rickson ought to come over here and take a course of treatment. He's had all he wants to do with this place, I guess, chuckled Will. There'll be others in the sweet by and by, too, snickered Sam. You're a Job's comforter, Sam. Think so? You know what the immortal Shakespeare said, don't you? He said, or rather he wrote, a good many bright things. What particular one do you refer to? Asked Will, beginning to nail the end of the plank. Suffering Jew sharps, howled Sam as the business end of the hammer came in sudden contact with his thumb as he started to drive in his second nail. That's what he said, was it? Said Will, laughing slyly. What are you laughing at? Think it's funny, don't you? in an aggravated tone of voice.
Hang the old thing. Why couldn't it go in straight?
Sucking at his injured digit. You should have taken aim at the head of the nail, not at your thumb.
Oh, bag your head, will you?
Growled Sam with pretended indignation. How about what Shakespeare said? Persisted Will after driving home his last nail.
That whack knocked it all out of my head,
he said as he also finished nailing up his end.
Want another board?
Yes.
All right, here you are.
And he pushed over the end of the second board.
Did you hear what happened to Stubbins when he was up to Boston?
No. What happened to him? Asked Will curiously.
He attended an Adams Express Company sale and bid in a box labeled dry goods. What do you suppose we found in it?
A bundle of calico, I guess, or something of that sort.
Not on your life. He found 6 bound volumes of the Congressional Record, snickered Sam.
That isn't so bad for you, Sam, but I wouldn't do it again if I were you.
Can't help it. Runs in our family. Dad and I were talking politics the other night, and I asked him what a political ring was made of, and he said, steel. Wouldn't that jar you? Have another board?
Grinned Sam. Pass it along.
By the way, Will,
said Sam after a few minutes of silence,
I heard today that the selectmen were going to give you a medal for your heroic conduct at the factory fire and saving the lives of Tessie Rickson and Jessie Fairweather.
Nonsense.
It's a fact. And the only committeeman who voted against the proposition was Squire Jarvis. He still claims it was you who broke into his office to get a hold of a certain promissory note that he had presented to your mother for payment. Nobody takes any stock in that, though. Constable Brady is on a still hunt after Ed Rickson, all right, and if he catches him, I guess there'll be something doing.
Will rather objected to a public acknowledgment of his noteworthy action at the factory fire, with the natural modesty of the true hero, but nevertheless he could not but feel flattered at the honor which his townsmen proposed to confer on him. Both Jessie and her mother had thanked him with such feeling and earnestness that there could be no doubt of their gratitude for the service he had rendered them. He felt this expression on their part amply repaid him for whatever risk he had run in Miss Fairweather's behalf. As for Tessie Rickson, she had made a special visit at the Sommers cottage to tell Will and his mother how much she appreciated his conduct on that thrilling occasion, when, as she glowingly expressed it, her life hung on a hair. Before she tore herself away, with evident reluctance, she had used up all the adjectives of her limited vocabulary. Well, said Will, after he and the sturdy Sam had worked for more than an hour on the dam, I guess that'll do. Very little water to get through here now. In a week, I shall begin to get some idea how things are going to pan out.
You mean that in a week you're going to discover what a chump you are, grinned his companion.
All right, have it your own way, returned the hopeful young inventor.
And you really do expect to make a pond here, said Sam incredulously.
That's what I hope to accomplish.
You'll have a pond, all right, but the water'll be out of sight.
That's just where we differ. I'm looking for it to show on top.
That's what Rickson looked for, but it didn't do him any good. If the water pushed that grass up once, it's going to do it again.
Sure of that, are you?
Of course I am. It stands to reason that it will.
If you wanted to find out the depth of that old dry well in your backyard without going down into it, how would you proceed?
That's simple. I drop a stone down and count the seconds that elapsed until it struck bottom, said Sam, pleased to display his knowledge of natural philosophy.
I'd tie a string to the stone and measure the string afterward, said Will. That shows you we look at the same thing from a different point of view.
Ha! Any fool could measure a well that way, said Sam contemptuously.
I've just taken as simple a way to make a pond here. The only difference between the two is that this is a game of chance.
Oh, you haven't the least chance in the world,
replied Sam. Then they gathered up their tools and left the spot. End of chapter 12. Chapter 13 of A Game of Chance by a Self-Made Man. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 13, in which Ed Rickson turns up again under peculiar circumstances. The Bugle and the News, the two weekly papers of Northport, came out that afternoon with a column account of the factory fire, and the Bugle in particular praised Will Sommers' heroism to the top notch. Both papers also published notices of the project afoot to present the boy with a medal as a mark of the town's appreciation, though the matter in the Times was dismissed with a 3-line item in the locals. In addition, each paper printed a report of Will's arrest and the examination before Justice Benson on the charge of breaking into Squire Jarvis's office and stealing certain papers from his desk. The Bugle's story was brief, and the charge commented on as baseless. On the other hand, the Times, the editor of which was a personal and political friend of Squire Jarvis, gave considerable space to the affair. But while the writer was careful to say nothing which could be construed as a reflection on the lad's honesty, nevertheless he scouted the idea that Ed Rickson was in any way implicated in the crime. On Monday morning Will returned to duty in the engine room, as the first and second floors of the factory were in shape to resume operation. Nothing had been heard from Squire Jarvis in respect to the promissory note. This, of course, was a matter of no surprise to Mrs. Sommers or her son, for it was not supposed that any action could be taken until the missing note should have been recovered. A thorough search for the mislaid receipt had proved unavailing. In spite of the fact that Sam Travis regarded the flooding of the swamp as a harebrained sort of proposition, nevertheless he was, boy-like, interested in the project, if only for the purpose of being the first to give his friend Will the laugh as soon as he had assured himself that the scheme was a failure, as he confidently expected that it must prove to be. So, during the week that followed the repairing of the dam, he made daily visits to the 10-acre bog after school. As a matter of course, the change, if any, in that short time in the appearance of the swamp was not so perceptible to him as if he had waited a week and then inspected it. So at the end of 8 days he reported to Will that the bog had not changed, even a little bit. "You are quite certain of that?" asked Will with a shade of disappointment in his voice. "Sure thing," asserted Sam, shaking his head dismally. "Same old grass and moss, though it looks a bit more soggy. There are a lot of little pools here and there, but that don't count for anything." "Well, I'm going out to take a look myself tonight. The moon will be up after 8 o'clock, and there should be light enough for me to see all I want." So after supper, Will started off alone for the swamp lot to size up the appearance of his game of chance. He had arrived within 100 yards of the place when he heard someone shouting in accents of terror, and the appeal undoubtedly came from the immediate vicinity of the quaking bog. "Somebody must have got caught in the swamp. It's as bad as quicksand," he said as he broke into a run. The moon was just rising about the tops of the trees that partially surrounded the swamp lot, so that the boy could easily see over the whole surface of the bog. The call for help sounded from the vicinity of the dam, and thither Will directed his steps. He soon made out a dark object floundering about on the surface of the swamp a few yards out. "Halloo!" he shouted encouragingly. "Help! Help!" answered the unfortunate being. A long broken limb was hanging pendant from a tree nearby. The boy seized it, and by a stout pole disengaged it from the heavy limb on which it had grown. Then he ran down to the edge of the morass, called to the struggling person imprisoned by the matted grass, and flung one end of the improvised pole toward him. The luckless person grabbed at it as a drowning man might a plank, and held on with desperate energy until Will succeeded in dragging him to firm ground. "Give me both your hands now," cried the boy. They were eagerly extended to him. Planting his feet firmly, Will gave a mighty tug. The person's feet were suddenly released by the grass, and both rolled over together on the dry turf beyond the danger line. They immediately struggled to their feet and looked at one another. The moon shone full on the face of the rescued stranger. Will recognized him instantly. "Ed Rickson!" he exclaimed. The fellow hastily scrambled to his feet without a word, and made a movement as if about to flee. "Hold on, Rickson, you needn't be in such a sweat." "I'm all alone," said Will. Rickson paused and looked keenly at the boy, and then gave a short laugh as if somewhat reassured. "Oh, it's you, Sommers, is it?" "It isn't anybody else. Where have you been hiding these last 10 days?" "Who says I've been hiding?" said Rickson gruffly. "I say so for one, and there are others." "Now look here, Will Sommers, do you want to do me a favor?" "I think I've just done one for you," said the boy grimly. "That's right, you have. But I want you to do something else for me. "What do you want me to do?" asked Will cautiously.
"I'm kind of fagged out. Haven't had a mouthful today. Will you fetch me something to eat and promise you won't say anything about having seen me out here?"
"You've got a pretty good nerve, I think, after what I've gone through on your account already."
"What do you mean by that?" asked Rickson sharply.
"You used those tools you stole from our place to break into Squire Jarvis's office. Then you left them in the place, and so I was accused of doing the job, because a certain paper we were supposed to be interested in was found missing."
Ed Rickson grinned as though he had just heard a good joke. "Oh, well, no harm came of it. Everybody knows you're a little angel who wouldn't be guilty of such a thing," he replied with a palpable sneer. "A fellow who goes to Sunday school and meeting regularly never goes wrong. Of course not. Canada isn't full of those kind of chaps."
"If you're so anxious for me to do you a favor, you're taking a strange way to get me to accommodate you," said Will in a tone of disgust at Rickson's coarse humor.
"Only a joke,"
the now wretched-looking wanderer answered hastily, as if suddenly conscious that he had gone too far.
"For heaven's sake, give me a bite of something to eat. I'm almost starved."
He certainly looked it, and there was a pathetic earnestness about his request that easily assured Will that Rickson told the truth. "Well," said the boy, "I can't refuse a hungry man something to eat, but it'll take me some time to get it here."
"You won't tell anyone you've met me here, will you?" asked Rickson anxiously.
"I shan't volunteer the information."
"And you promise not to fetch anybody back with you? I shall be on the watch, so it won't do any good."
"I'll return alone," said Will coldly.
"I wish you'd fetch a blanket with you if you could, for it's mighty cold hanging around here, especially when a fellow's trousers are soaked to the skin," said Rickson dismally.
"Where do you sleep?" asked Will as he prepared to depart on his charitable errand.
"I've got a snug place," he replied with one of his impudent grins. "Now, don't be any longer than you can help, Sommers. If you've got a spark of feeling for a fellow in my condition—"
and Rickson contorted his countenance into an expression of great physical anguish in order to give additional effect to his appeal. End of chapter 13. Chapter 14 of A Game of Chance by a Self-Made Man. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 14, in which Will Sommers learns some interesting facts of a conspiracy of which he was the intended victim. Will was as good as his word, and half an hour later reported to the 10-acre swamp lot with a liberal supply of plain food, which his mother had provided at his request, without asking any questions he could not answer. He had it wrapped up in a newspaper, the whole tucked into the folds of an old horse blanket. When Will struck the open space facing the bog where he had held his brief conversation with the disreputable son of Joe Rickson, he found no one in sight. "He couldn't have gotten tired of waiting, for I wasn't so very long away," thought the kind-hearted boy as he transferred his bundle from one arm to the other. "Well, it's his lookout, so while I'm waiting for him I'll take a look at the swamp." So he walked slowly along the edge of the quaking bog, examining its surface with the greatest attention and interest. He had taken care to gauge the original height of the marsh before he began to flood it, marking its level by means of sticks thrust horizontally out from the sides of the basin. By looking at these guides, he saw that so far the swamp itself had not risen to any noticeable extent. This was encouraging, though not conclusive evidence that the scheme would eventually be successful. The water was certainly forming on top of the matted grass. 100 little pools were visible upon its surface, which looked very watery and glistening in the cold moonshine. "I don't think I can find any reason to kick so far," mused Will with a sense of satisfaction. "In another week I hope to see a clear enough, though perhaps shallow, sheet of water above the grass. Well, the saying is, nothing ventured, nothing won. You have got to take chances in this world if you expect to do something worthwhile." At this point in his reflections he fancied he heard the sound of voices somewhere near at hand. He was standing at the side of the swamp opposite the outlet where the dam was. He listened. It was the 1st of November, and the country air was quite still. There was scarcely a breath of air stirring, and the bare trees stood silent and motionless in the moonlight. "Somebody's talking, all right," said Will to himself, "which is a pretty good sign he isn't alone. I wonder if that can be Rickson. If so, who is he talking with? He seemed to be mighty scary about anyone knowing he was out here. Well, that's his business, not mine." Will walked on a little further, and the sounds grew plainer. "That's Rickson talking for a fact. Evidently he's run across some friend he isn't afraid of." The boy sat down on the stump of a tree, and now the voices reached his ear quite plainly.
"Look here, Lewis,"
said Rickson roughly, as if he was out of patience.
"I've stood your shilly-shallying long enough. I want that money you promised me, and if you don't stump up by this time tomorrow night, I'll not only find a means of letting your father know the truth of that matter, but I'll put Will Sommers wise to the whole thing also."
"You wouldn't dare!" ejaculated Jarvis, for it was indeed the son of the magnate of Northport, who was holding a converse with Ed Rickson in the shade of the trees.
"Wouldn't I? You evidently don't know me, young fellow. You see the trouble I've got into all on your account. I don't dare show my face lest I be arrested for the crime you intended to fasten on Will Sommers."
"If you hadn't been such a fool that night when you broke into Sommers' tool house to get those tools and let him recognize you, he never would have been able to throw suspicion in your direction."
"He came on me so suddenly that he took me by surprise. I supposed everybody was in bed and asleep," said Rickson in excuse.
"You should have waited an hour or two longer anyway. You spoiled everything by your haste. If the plan had succeeded, as I supposed it would when I proposed the thing to you when I met you in Gateville, I would have given you the money right away. It wasn't my fault you tangled things up the way you did."
"Well, I've earned the price we agreed on, and I'm going to have it, or somebody'll have to suffer. That's all there is to it," said Ed Rickson doggedly.
"You haven't earned it, for the scheme failed. Nobody outside my father believes Will Sommers guilty of breaking into the governor's office, and I wouldn't be surprised if my father has his suspicions."
"He'll have more than that if you don't fork over that $100 you promised me," said Rickson in a threatening tone.
"I'll give you $25 tomorrow."
"No, you won't. You'll give me the 100. You understand? I'm sorry I went into the thing anyway. Sommers isn't a half-bad sort of chap. He pulled me out of the swamp here an hour ago, and I expect him back with some grub, or something that I need as bad as any man alive. Next time you want any dirty work done, just look up somebody else to do it. If I was to give you away to Sommers, he'd probably thump the stuffing out of you, and 'twould serve you right."
"He'd thump nothing out of me," sneered Lewis angrily. "I hate the pauper. I'd have given $100 willingly to have seen him gone to jail."
"For a crime he is innocent of, eh?" said Rickson with a sneer. "You're a peach."
"That's none of your business," retorted his companion in an ugly tone.
"All right. Cough up the $100, and we'll let it go at that. I'll let you have the papers back, and you can say you found them in the grass outside your house. If you fail me, young fellow, you'll find yourself in a heap of trouble."
"I'll have you arrested if you dare do anything like that," cried Lewis hotly.
"You will, you little monkey," exclaimed Rickson, grabbing him by the arm. "I've a great mind to chuck you into the marsh."
"Let me go, will you?"
"Are you going to fetch me that $100?
His manner was so menacing that Lewis Jarvis yielded in his fright.
"Yes, I'll give it to you." "Then see that you turn up here tomorrow night with the cash. If you try to trick me, I'll make you suffer in a way you won't soon forget."
"I'll get even with you some day for this, Ed Rickson. See if I don't," said the young aristocrat darkly as he backed away.
"All right, my buck, but I advise you not to try it," said Rickson with a harsh laugh.
Lewis muttered something under his breath and walked off under the trees. A moment later, Will Sommers saw Rickson pushing his way through the bushes toward the open spot of their encounter an hour previous, so he rose from his seat and followed him. When Rickson came out into the moonlight, he discovered Will within a few yards of him.
"Hello,"
he said with a hungry glance at the bundle.
"You fetched the grub, have you? Let's have it."
Will relinquished possession of the blanket and its contents. Rickson unrolled the bundle, cast the blanket on the ground, and attacked the package of food with the greediness of a famished hyena.
"Sommers, you're all right,"
said Rickson with his mouth full. "I wish I could return the compliment," replied Will coldly. "You stole a hammer and chisel from our tool house for the deliberate purpose of getting me into trouble."
"Who says I did?"
replied Rickson with a malicious grin. "I say so."
"You're off your base, Sommers."
"Am I? Perhaps you'll not admit that Lewis Jarvis hired you to execute the job."
"Oh,
exclaimed Rickson, evidently astonished at the extent of Will's knowledge on the subject. "What put that into your head?" "No matter," replied Will coolly. "Isn't it a fact?" "You're dreaming, boy." "Look here, Rickson, I think I've treated you pretty white. I pulled you out of a bad hole and brought you a square feed. Why don't you own up?" "Nothing doing," grinned Ed. "Then I've got nothing more to say," said Will, turning on his heel and starting off. Ed Rickson allowed him to go without another word. "A nice pair, he and Louis Jarvis," muttered Will as he walked slowly homeward. "A rascally piece of business for the son of Northport's most prominent citizen, and such a reckless scamp as Ed Rickson to engage in. You're trying down a boy who never did either of them any harm. Rickson has that note in his possession, so I'll just give Constable Brady a quiet tip that these two conspirators have arranged to meet in the vicinity of the 10-acre swamp lot tomorrow night. It's not impossible that Louis Jarvis may find that his little scheme has developed into a boomerang, which may land him and his side partner in jail on a very serious charge. It's a poor rule that doesn't work both ways." End of Chapter 14. Chapter 15 of A Game of Chance by a Self-Made Man. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 15, in which Louis Jarvis originates another scheme for the undoing of Will Sommers. On the following evening, Constable Brady and an assistant visited the woods about the 10-acre swamp lot, but failed to find any trace of Ed Rickson or his associate in iniquity. So the matter rested for the present. Whether Louis Jarvis had paid the $100 or effected some kind of a compromise with Ed Rickson, Will Sommers had no means of knowing. The matter had undoubtedly been satisfactorily arranged between them, as young Jarvis maintained his usual bold front in public, which showed he felt no apprehension of an exposure. During the next 10 days, evidence of the successful flooding of the swamp lot was so apparent that even Sam Travis hauled in his horns and said to all his friends that if there was a smarter boy in Northport than Will Sommers, he'd like to make his acquaintance. Will's silly attempt to fill up the bog with stones the preceding winter, which everybody who had heard about the matter supposed to be his object, had been generally forgotten. Now, however, when it began to be known that a pond had actually formed in the basin of the swamp lot, scores of curious townspeople tramped out to the spot to see the miracle with their own eyes. There it was, sure enough. It was a fine pond of water, and was daily growing deeper. Somebody carried the news to Joe Rickson. "Ridiculous," was his comment. "But I've just seen it with my own eyes," protested his informant, rather glad than otherwise to rub it in on the old fellow who was so generally disliked. "Pooh, you can't tell me any such nonsense," grunted the man who had already burned his fingers with the scheme of originating an ice privilege. All the same, as soon as his visitor had gone, he put on his old hat and started out to convince himself that the man had been jollying him. Needless to say, he found what he neither expected nor desired to see. "It seems that Will Sommers has the bulge on you, after all," said a neighbor who had also come to inspect the marvel, rubbing his hands gleefully as if Rickson's takedown particularly pleased him. At first Joe Rickson was too much astonished to speak. He could hardly believe the evidence of his eyes. But after a while he began to realize that somehow nature had turned him down in favor of the young fireman of the Northport cotton mills. Then he made a few marks that could hardly be reproduced with propriety in print, but they expressed his sentiments on the subject with unpolished directness. When Will first took hold of the scheme, the person who most persistently jeered him was Louis Jarvis. "What else can you expect from such a lobster?" was his sneering comment. Then, as time went on, he, like others, forgot all about the matter. Now its revival as a successful issue jarred his feelings. He refused to believe all reports concerning the actual flooding of the swamp lot, until the Northport papers printed a news item on the subject. Then he went out to the site of the quaking bog himself, and what he saw did not make him feel happy. He comprehended that the young mechanic he despised so much had managed to solve a very clever problem. "I never saw such a piece of luck," he muttered in a tone of disgust. "When that water freezes through, the pauper will have a regular ice harvest to dispose of, It's a shame how luck will play into the hands of the common people. Why, that beggar will think he's as good as I am. If I only knew some way to head him off." He was standing near the dam, and as he spoke an idea suddenly came into his head that pleased him greatly. "'Twill be just the thing," he grinned malevolently. "By the great horn spoon, I'll take him down a couple of pegs. It'll break him all up to have his great scheme go up in the air on the last moment. This is better than if I had landed him in jail, for he was bound to get clear of that in the end. But this, well, this will pickle his hopes in great shape. It'll be a dead easy cinch for Ed Rickson to earn another 25 bones. Then I guess it'll be time for me to find that note and hand it over to the governor. He'll do the rest. Nothing like rubbing it in good and hard when you get the chance." That afternoon, Lewis Jarvis took a train for a certain town 30 miles away, where he knew he should be able to find Ed Rickson. As a matter of fact, Ed was on the lookout for him, for Lewis had agreed with him to settle his $100 obligation after paying him $25 down, and the first of these payments was due now. "I thought you wouldn't go back on me," grinned young Rickson significantly when Lewis turned up at the appointed rendezvous, a roadhouse on the outskirts of town, where Rickson had secured employment congenial to his tastes. "Why should I?" answered Lewis, as if offended at the very idea of such a thing. He had an axe to grind, and it behooved him to keep on friendly terms with his former co-partner in guilt. "That's right. Why should you?" said Rickson. "I suppose you brought the cash?" he added eagerly. "Sure thing," and Lewis produced $25 in notes, which he handed over. "You're a little man of your word, Lewis," said Ed, stowing the money away. "Come inside and have a drink." Lewis was not accustomed to intoxicating liquor, as the Squire very properly frowned upon any such indulgence in his own son, whose sole form of dissipation was confined to the superior brand of imported cigarettes. But the boy was ashamed to refuse Rickson's invitation lest Ed twit him as a milksop. Secretly he believed drinking was a manly art, for he had seen his father slightly under the influence of stimulants on several occasions, and the recollection of his parents' weakness in this respect stilled his own conscience. So he stood up to the bar, and Ed poured out a couple of whiskeys. "Here's luck," said Rickson, swallowing his like a veteran. Lewis's portion nearly strangled him, for it was a fiery compound and none of the best. "Went the wrong way, did it?" grinned Ed. "Take some water." Lewis presented a sad picture as he stood gasping over the dose, which had brought tears to his eyes. Indeed, it is always a sad picture to see a young man. It was far from worse in this case, for Lewis Jarvis was only 17, taking his first lessons in that curse of civilization, liquor drinking. That it is the root of all evil is graphically illustrated in that piece of Oriental fiction called The Arabian Nights, which recites that a genie, or wicked spirit, having obtained control over a certain young man, agreed to spare his life on condition that his dupe should commit one of 3 mortal sins, either to murder his father, curse his god, or get drunk. The young man chose what he considered the least of the 3. He got drunk, with the result that on being taxed with his sin by his father, he in a burst of fury killed him. Then, realizing his crime, he in despair cursed his Maker and the day he was born. Lewis Jarvis soon recovered from the effects of the potation, and after a short conversation on sporting topics he broached the real subject of his visit. "How was that for an idea?" grinned Lewis, proud of the mean scheme he had devised. "I'll have him dead to rights, eh?" "You've got a great lead, Lewis," said Rickson with a sneer. "So you want me to sneak into Northport again and work it for you?" "Yes." "How much do I get?" $25. "Cash down?" "Yes, but you'll have to give me more time on what I owe you on the old account." Rickson considered a few minutes and then agreed to the proposal. "When do you want it done?" "Any time within a week will do." "All right. Have another drink." And the hardened young fellow replenished the tumblers. Lewis looked at his portion and hesitated. "What's the matter?" laughed Rickson banteringly. "Can't you go 2 drinks?" "Sure," replied Lewis, flushing up as he grasped the glass. "Maybe you'd better dilute it," grinned Ed tantalizingly. "Pooh!" cried Lewis, raising it to his chin. "I'm no baby. All the same, the liquor gave him another coughing fit, and he was glad to take some water afterward. When he boarded the train for home half an hour later, he was rather unsteady on his legs. End of chapter 15. Chapter 16 of A Game of Chance by a Self-Made Man. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 16. All's Well That Ends Well. The railroad station was not far from the Northport cotton mills, and Louis Jarvis had to pass the factory on his way home. He had not noticed Jessie Fairweather since the evening Will Sommers had interfered between them on her behalf, and with good reason, for the spirited girl took good care to keep out of his way, having no desire for any further intercourse with him. Louis was feeling somewhat exalted from the stimulating effect of bad whiskey on his brain. As he came along, the factory girls were leaving the mills, the full force having been put to work that day for the first time since the fire. Jessie was walking slowly down the street in expectation that Will would soon catch up with her as usual. He had not yet appeared when Louis Jarvis saw her ahead. The sight of her at this moment aroused all that was ugly in his disposition. He hastened his steps and soon caught up with her. "Going to speak with me this time, aren't you?" he demanded in a husky voice and with a half-intoxicated leer that startled the girl. Jessie made no answer but started to cross to the other side of the road, when he put out his hand and roughly detained her. "Going to answer me or not?" he said menacingly.
"Leave me alone, Will Jarvis," she cried angrily. "You wouldn't dare touch me if Will Sommers was here."
"What do I care for Sommers?" he returned with a hiccup. "Miserable pauper. Common upstart. Thinks he's as good as me. Know who I am, don't you?"
"I believe you have been drinking," cried Jessie in dismay.
"Been drinking? Sure thing. All gentlemen drink. My father's Squire, most important gentleman of the town. He drinks. So do I."
"If you don't take your hand from my arm, Louis Jarvis," cried Jessie desperately, "I'll slap your face."
"Which face? This face?" asked Louis with drunken humor. "You'll slap nothing, see? I've got you now, and I'm going to kiss you." At this threat, Jessie struck him full in the face, but he seized her in both his arms and tried to carry out his purpose. Jessie, unable to help herself further, uttered a shrill scream which reached Will's ears as he was coming out of the engine-yard gate. The boy started to her assistance at once. He was full of fight this time and furious at seeing her struggling in the grasp of a well-dressed ruffian, for he did not at once recognize Louis Jarvis. Coming up at a run, he seized Louis boldly as the young aristocrat was bending back her head to accomplish his reckless object, and, tearing him away from the girl, he flung him in a heap against the fence.
"Oh, Will!"
cried Jessie impulsively, throwing her arms about his neck and dropping her face on his shoulder. She burst into hysterical weeping. "What was he trying to do, Jessie?"
"Oh, he was going to kiss me,"
she sobbed like a frightened child. "It's Louis Jarvis, isn't it?" he cried in some astonishment, now recognizing the squire's son, as that reckless youth staggered to his feet with a fierce scowl on his features.
"Yes, and he's been drinking," shuddered the girl.
"Oh, yes? I'll get square with you for that, Will Sommers," yelled Louis furiously. "I will if I have to die for it." "Come along, Jessie," said Will, ignoring the vengeful youth. Louis shook his fist after them as they passed on. "You pauper, you! I'll fix that dam for you and burst your whole scheme up. You understand? You'll strike me, will you, you beggar? I'll fix you. Just see if I don't," he screamed out. Will heard the threat, but he and Jessie went on as if Louis had spoken to the empty air. Louis watched them out of sight before he left the spot. It was getting dark now, and he managed to reach home without attracting any comment. Fortunately for him, his father was absent in Boston on business, and so he escaped a well-merited reprimand for the condition he was in. That week Will received from Washington a certificate, confirming to him for the usual number of years the patent rights on his improved damper regulator, and the superintendent made an agreement with his mother, as his guardian, for its use in the factory engine room on a regular royalty. Specifications for his new steam economizer and condenser were at the same time drawn up and forwarded to a patent attorney in the capital city to be patented, and we may well state here that in due time he sold the rights to the Northport cotton mills for $5,000. Superintendent Harper had, at Will's request, visited the swamp lot and investigated the outlook. His verdict assured the boy that he would have a 10-acre field of ice in due course to sell to the Rockland Ice Company, which was in the market for such privileges as soon as they were ripe. "How did you manage it?" asked Mr. Harper curiously. "You seem to have had better luck than Mr. Rickson." And then Will told him all about it. "Upon my word, you are a bright boy, for a fact. I never should have thought of that plan myself, had I been in your shoes. Well, you deserve all your luck. Your game of chance has turned out to be a game of certainty, after all." As they left the spot, they did not see a crouching form hiding in the underbrush. It was Ed Rickson, and he had a crowbar with him. As soon as all was still again, he clambered out on the dam, and inserting the end of the bar between a narrow crack in the boards, began to pry them apart. His object was apparent. He meant to make a sufficiently large opening in the dam to allow the confined water to escape. By morning, the prospects of an ice harvest on the 10-acre lot would be ruined, for that season at least. Fortunately, the plans of the wicked do not always prosper. Before Will reached home, he missed his big horn-handled jackknife, which was a handy companion in the engine-room repair shop. "By George," he said, "I remember I laid that down on one of the stringers of the dam while I was talking to Mr. Harper. I must go back and get it." So he hastily retraced his steps. As he drew near the dam, he heard queer sounds, not unlike the ripping of boards, and he began to wonder. "Great Scott! It can't be those boards are giving away under the pressure of the water. If they are, the pond will be ruined in a few hours." He rushed forward to investigate. At that moment the moon, which had been obscured all evening, suddenly shone out between a rift in the clouds, and Will saw something that staggered him. It was Ed Rickson, hard at work in his effort to destroy the dam. "Hi there! What are you doing?" Will cried in astonished anger. Rickson turned in a startled way and dropped the crowbar into the water. "Come out of that!" exclaimed Will. "God of thunder!" replied the rascal. "So would you, Ed Rickson. You're a nice scoundrel, you are. Trying to spoil my property," ejaculated Will, as mad as he could be when he came to realize the despicable attempt to ruin his ice privilege. "Well, it's me, all right," replied Rickson in surly tones, for he saw the game was up, especially as the crowbar was gone. "What are you going to do about it?" "I'm going to hand you over to Constable Brady right away." "You tell it well, you little monkey. If I get a hold of you, I'm going to polish you off quicker than grease lightning." And he meant it, too. Now, it happened that Will's blood was up, and so reckless of consequences was he that he clambered out on the dam, determined to bring Ed Rickson to justice at last. Ed saw him coming and waited with a diabolical grin. He was satisfied he could easily handle Will Sommers, as stout a lad as he looked. When they tackled in the center of the dam, he found out that the job was not as easy as he had supposed. It was a pretty even thing, however, as to which would come out ahead. "Wait until I get a good grip on you, and I'll toss you into your pond, blast you!" gritted Ed. As they struggled and struck at one another on top of the dam, they were in alternate light and shadow, as the moon shone down upon their writhing forms or hid her face behind a drifting cloud. It was a fight to the finish, and no mistake. Will was a bit overmatched, but not outclassed. With all his fighting qualities aroused, he was crowding his more experienced antagonist pretty hard. He was strong and tough, and his fists were like small sledgehammers. Every time they landed on Rickson, he grunted, while Will took his own punishment in silence, never yielding an inch to his antagonist in any stage, though the blood trickled from a nasty cut over his eye. At length, Will's greater power of endurance began to prevail. Taking advantage of this, the boy ducked down, seized Ed's leg below the knee, and jerking it up, overbalanced his antagonist, who pitched sideways into the water of the pond. That ended the fight. Rickson came up from his plunge completely subdued. It was not improbable that, had he been left to himself, he might have been drowned, so exhausted was he. Will, however, grabbed him by the collar of his jacket and slowly dragged him to firm ground. He then took the precaution to bind his hands behind his back. Will marched his prisoner to the residence of Constable Brady, a quarter of a mile away, who took him to the town jail. Next day Will Sommers went before Justice Benson and swore out a complaint of malicious mischief against Ed Rickson. Ed lost no time in sending for Louis Jarvis. "Get me out of this, do you understand?" he said to Louis when the lad appeared, "or I'll blow the whole business from beginning to end." Louis, terrified at the thought of public exposure, promised to enlist his father in Rickson's behalf. In order to secure the squire's cooperation, it is probable that Louis made a clean breast of the matter to his father. At any rate, Squire Jarvis appeared for Ed when he was brought before Justice Benson. The prisoner was also charged with burglarizing the lawyer's office. The nabob, of course, refused to press this charge, and as there was not sufficient evidence against the rascal, it was allowed to drop. Will, with Sam Travis's assistance, recovered the short crowbar with which Rickson had intended to break down the dam and produced it against the prisoner. Rickson flatly denied that he had used it against Will's property with malicious intent, but both Will and Sam, as well as Constable Brady, who had visited the dam, testified to the abrasures on the boards, which admitted of but one construction, so Ed was adjudged guilty by the justice and sentenced to 30 days' imprisonment. A day or so later, Squire Jarvis called on Mrs. Sommers and notified her that, the promissory note having been recovered, she would be held for its payment. When Will came home from the factory, his mother told him of the squire's visit. "We'll contest it, Mother, on the ground of fraud. Call on Sam Travis's father. He's a good lawyer, and he'll advise you in the matter." After supper, Jessie Fairweather came in, as she often did, to show Mrs. Sommers a new dress pattern she had received from Boston.
"I've got something to tell you, Will," she said while Mrs. Sommers was out of the room for a short interval. "But you must promise not to say a word about it to anyone."
"All right," said Will. "I promise."
"Tessie Rickson came to me today and begged that I would become friendly with her again, for she said as long as she and I were not on speaking terms, none of the other girls would notice her. She admitted that it was she who put her pocketbook in the pocket of my dress on the day of the fire, in the hope of disgracing me. She said Louis Jarvis had put her up to it, and had told her I had said many unkind things about her, which of course was not so, and she now knows that Louis Jarvis simply made a dupe of her in order to get square with me. But the worst thing of all, Will, she confessed to me that she was the cause of the fire at the mill, and told me why she set a match to the dresses of certain girls without thinking any further damage would result. She's a thoughtless girl with very poor principles, and I feel sorry for her."
"She'd get into a peck of trouble if it became known that she started the fire at the factory," said Will, not a little astonished at the revelation.
"Well, I must be going," Jessie said, as Mrs. Sommers returned to the room. "Why, what's the matter with the clock? It must be 8:30 now, but the hands point to 7:15, just as they did when I entered the room."
"Evidently it stopped," said Will, walking up to the mantelpiece. He took up a little Dutch timepiece and began to examine it. "The heat must have warped the bottom, for the pendulum is caught on the swelling of the wood." While fumbling with it, the bottom suddenly came way in his hand, and a small piece of folded paper dropped out. Jessie picked it up and handed it to Mrs. Sommers, who casually opened it.
"Why, Will,"
she said in a tone of mingled surprise and joy,
"here's the missing receipt at last."
"You don't mean it, Mother!" exclaimed the boy in amazement. His mother passed it to him. "Received of Nathaniel Sommers the sum of $306 in full satisfaction of his note of hand bearing date of April 20, 1895, read Will. "And it's signed by Joe Rickson. That settles it, Mother. You don't want a lawyer now."
"Isn't that splendid?" exclaimed Jessie, clapping her hands with pleasure. "How fortunate that the dear old clock stopped."
"The clock your father gave us, too," added Will. "You were the first who noticed that it had stopped business for the first time since it came into our possession. I think you deserve a reward. Don't you, Mother?" as he laid down the curious old timepiece.
"A reward? You silly— Oh!"
She could not help the exclamation, because just at that moment Will unexpectedly kissed her. Will allowed the case to be brought into court, and then when Squire Jarvis was gloating over the bill of costs he thought Widow Sommers would have to pay, she produced the receipt, and covered both the nabob and Joe Rickson with confusion. The same day, too, Will was waited on by 3 members of the town council and presented with the gold medal, appropriately inscribed, which had been awarded to him in recognition of his heroism at the factory fire. Will Sommers' 10-acre pond produced an ice privilege in January, which netted him something like $3,000. Not only that, but the swamp lot thereafter annually netted him a similar sum, so that his game of chance after all resulted in a permanent income. Just enough for you and I to buy a nice little house and start housekeeping within a year or two, he said to Jessie when he showed her his first check from the Rockland Ice Company, and Jessie blushed radiantly and clapped her pretty fingers over his mouth. The end. End of Chapter 16. End of A Game of Chance, by a Self-Made Man. End of Fame and Fortune Weekly, number 4. Recording by Keith Salis.